There used to be a time when a question could have opened the sky. Before the answers hardened, before knowing put up fences in the grass of your mind, there was a flicker, a wondering. You remember it vaguely now. Like a dream, you remembered more than memory. You didn't need reasons then. You needed stars. And the stars never gave reasons. They only invited you to ask again. But something changed. Not all at once. Not with a cry. Wonder doesn't vanish like that. It doesn't make it through. Quietly, it's drawn off like the light from a room, slowly until you don't notice it's gone. You still go outside. You still look at the moon, but the question in your eyes is lessened. You no longer wonder what it is. You wonder when it will come up. You wonder if it exists at all. You ask what it can do for you. You overlook to ask what it is. This is the first silent death. The death of the question that existed for nothing, the child's wonder that did not have a purpose, which was not intended to win or solve or build, but simply to wander and be awed. Now you calculate, you optimize. You don't see clouds and think of monsters or ships. You see and check the weather. Your imagination was not exhausted. It was trained. Usefulness killed it. The pats on the back of being practical and focused and realistic, these were the magic spells that smoothed out the rough edges of your brain until the wild corners were tamed. You were applauded for learning to stop dreaming, and the theater of the impossible began closing. No more invisible friends. No more questions that might lead nowhere. No more belief in things that do not fit. You stopped building castles out of air and began stacking facts instead. They told you this was growing up. They said this was intelligence. But they never warned you that something vital would die in the process. And yet, something always does. No one holds funerals for lost awe. No one lights candles for wonder when it slips into the dark. But it happens. 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 silent surrenders. You remember being told not to stare out the window. You remember learning that daydreaming was a waste of time. You remember how eventually you believed them. This is not a condemnation. It is a remembering. Because buried beneath your skill set, beneath the armor of knowing, beneath the muscle of your mind, there is a soft, blinking animal that once looked at the world without expectation, a creature that could be moved by shadows on a wall, that could stare at dust in a beam of light and feel something sacred. You haven't heard it in a while, but it hasn't gone. Wonder does not die completely. It hibernates, it waits for silence, for surrender, for the moment when you stop needing to be right and instead ask, what if? What if gravity was a question, not a rule? What if your shadow had secrets? What if time isn't moving forward but curling inward? These are not questions you answer. These are questions you keep, like pebbles in your pocket, like stars you name but never touch. There is a death that happens when you no longer feel small, not insignificant, small, in awe, in reverence. A mind that feels too large has no space left for mystery, and mystery is the soil from which wonder grows. So you begin to shrink yourself, not in shame, but in reverence. You allow yourself to not know. You forgive yourself for not understanding. You remember that the sky does not need decoding, it needs witnessing. That's how resurrection begins, not with answers, with awe. You watch a spider build its web and resist the urge to compare it to algorithms. You hear wind in the trees and stop trying to isolate the pitch. You stare at the stars and do not reach for names. You simply let them be distant, bright, impossible. And in that moment, wonder takes a breath again. It does not arrive with fireworks. It returns like mist, like something ancient, like a voice inside you that has always been speaking, waiting for you to stop translating it into logic. Wonder does not need to be understood to be loved. It needs to be felt. So tonight, as your mind softens, allow the extinct parts of yourself to stir. Let the dry riverbed of your attention fill once more with questions that cannot be answered. Let the silence be sacred. Let not knowing be a kind of worship. Let yourself remember what it felt like to marvel, not as a task, not as a skill, but as a way of being, a soft way to live, a quiet way to die and be reborn. There is a kind of forgetting that doesn't feel like loss. It feels like adaptation, like growing into clothes that no longer fit your questions. You adjust, you tighten your thoughts, you learn the approved rhythms, and slowly the wild reaches of wonder are trimmed down into lanes. This is how the map replaces the landscape. You begin to mistake description for understanding. A word is offered, gravity, consciousness, dark matter, and you nod, as if naming is knowing. But the world has never asked to be named. It only asked to be seen. Once you looked at a candle and imagined it dreaming. Now you see combustion. Once you stared into the sky and wondered what the moon tasted like. Now you Google its mineral content. What was once enchanted becomes explained, and explanation, repeated often enough, becomes silence, the kind that doesn't invite you back. And yet, there is something in you that still recoils when someone says, everything can be understood. Something deep, quiet, defiant, because you remember, if only faintly, that not understanding was once the most sacred feeling of all. Do you still feel it? That twitch behind your ribs when you stare too long at a mirror in a dark room? That pause before sleep when a thought arrives that doesn't want to be solved, only held? That is wonder, knocking softly. It doesn't want to prove anything. It doesn't want to win. It wants you to sit beside it in the not knowing. And this, perhaps, is how we survive its extinction. Not by reviving the impossible, but by slowing down enough to notice what has not yet left. Some thoughts never arrive as words. They flicker in the distance of awareness, half-born, unfinished. You feel them like static behind the eyes, or tension in the chest without a name. They never form sentences, never declare themselves, but they linger. They loop, and in their quiet repetition, they change you. This is the death of the expressed self, not by suppression, but by erosion. Not because someone said you couldn't speak, but because slowly you began to believe there was no use in trying. You still think, but the thoughts remain locked inside the throat of the mind, pacing like ghosts. You still feel, but the feeling is too shapeless, too fragile, too much. So it folds back in. The silence begins not with absence but with doubt, a hesitation. You open your mouth to say something, anything, and close it again. You rewrite your message 5 times, then delete it. You decide your story isn't interesting. Your question is dumb. Your pain is inconvenient. Your awe is excessive, so you don't say it. And the thought remains inside, circling. But thoughts not spoken still echo. They do not vanish. They compress. They condense into the marrow of your gestures, into your micro-expressions, into the pause that comes too late in the conversation. The world hears your silence and assumes its emptiness, but inside you are echoing. There's a strange violence in this kind of invisibility. Not loud, not obvious, a soft violence, a life quietly rewritten to be more tolerable for others. So you shrink your words to fit their pace. You smooth your language until it loses its edge. You wear your thoughts like underclothes, necessary but hidden. Over time, the pressure mounts. Not dramatic, just constant. A low hum of unfinished things. You feel it most when you're alone. When you hear a song and it sparks something, but there's no one to tell. When you read a line in a book that mirrors your shadow, but you turn the page without underlining it. When you sit in a room full of people and still feel unspoken. This is not about being silenced by force. It is about being trained to withhold. The world rewards the digestible, the efficient, the polished, the understandable. So we rehearse versions of ourselves that are easier to translate. We speak in safe patterns. We curate our sincerity. We echo what others already know. But not every thought fits the mold. Some thoughts arrive unfinished because they should remain open. Not everything must resolve into a message. Not every feeling needs a headline. Some thoughts are doorways. You don't walk through them to find meaning. You stand in the threshold and feel the wind. But the world doesn't wait for your pauses. It wants declarations, conclusions. It wants you to know. And so the untold thoughts shrink into your architecture. Not dead, just dormant, like seeds never watered. And you feel the weight of them, not as grief, but as a subtle misalignment, a friction beneath the skin. You laugh, but it doesn't reach your spine. You agree, but something resists. You go along, but something twists in the chest. Not because you're dishonest, but because the self that remains unspoken begins to forget it is allowed to exist. This is the echo of the untold, a question that never became a sentence, a realization you never voiced aloud, a truth you felt too late to say. And it builds, not as pain, as pressure, a density in the soul. You begin to notice it in how you hesitate to write, how you stare at blank pages longer, how you avoid mirrors, how conversations feel increasingly scripted. Not because you have nothing to say, but because the part of you that knows is slowly being overwritten by the part of you that performs. And still, no collapse, just silence, just another loop. Until you wake one day and realize you haven't told anyone the truth in weeks. Not because you're lying, but because you've stopped knowing what the truth is when it stays too long inside. That's the cost of not speaking, not to others, but to yourself. There is something sacred about articulation, not for validation, but for recognition. A thought, once shaped, becomes real. It becomes traceable. It becomes yours. But the untold thought stays liquid. It slips through memory. You remember you felt something. You forget what it meant. Sometimes the echo is a poem that never reached the page. Sometimes it's a confession caught in the throat. Sometimes it's the observation you made while watching someone you love leave the room. That thing you saw in their body, their stillness, that small ache of knowing they were drifting. And you never said it. You never told them you saw them disappearing. The world is full of these thoughts. They cling to the ceilings of quiet rooms. They hum in shared silences between strangers. They ripple between people who once knew each other well. Every untold thought leaves a trace, not a scar, a shape, a hollow where something could have bloomed. But stillness is not the enemy. The untold is not failure. Sometimes a thought is not ready. Sometimes you are not ready. Sometimes silence is protection. A chrysalis, not a cage. What matters is not that every thought be said, but that you notice when they begin to disappear before they arrive. That you feel when your inner language begins to fray. That you remember how to listen for what is waiting beneath the noise. Because somewhere in you the first thought still echoes, the first one you were too scared to speak, the one that asked if anyone would listen, the one that whispered, "What if I said what I really think?" And maybe the echo was never meant to fade. Maybe it was meant to guide you back, to the voice beneath the performance, to the raw edge of your mind, to the part of you that doesn't need an audience, only a witness. So let yourself speak again, not loudly, not perfectly, just enough. Even if the thought is tangled, even if it doesn't land, even if the sentence breaks in half before it ends, let it echo, let it breathe. Because not all thoughts must be complete to be true, and not all truths must be shouted to be real. There was no explosion, no headlines, no parade of final questions. It had ended quietly in the middle of an ordinary moment, maybe while scrolling, maybe while nodding along in a meeting, maybe while hearing a child ask something simple and strange, and responding, not with wonder, but with dismissal. That was the day we stopped asking why. Not in every word, but in the way we meant it, in the pause after a question, when curiosity used to bloom, and now something else arrives, fatigue, cynicism, apathy, the kind of tired that doesn't come from effort, but from repetition, from feeling like the answers don't matter anymore. We learned to ask how instead. How does it work? How do I get more? How can I fix it, hack it, monetize it, simplify it? But why? The root question, the one that digs down and keeps going, slowly fell out of favor. It became inefficient, impractical, uncomfortable, and so it faded. Like a language we used to speak before speed became more important than meaning. You can still hear it if you listen, in the quiet after a strange dream, in the stillness of a sunset that makes no sense but moves something, in the part of you that once stared at the sky and didn't want to understand it. Just feel it. But most days the question goes unasked. Because why doesn't give quick returns? It doesn't boost productivity. It doesn't plug neatly into the metrics. It disrupts. It slows things down. It asks too much. It risks revealing that the ladder we're climbing might be leaning on the wrong wall. And we were taught not to risk that. Instead, we were taught to fill the space with certainty, with systems, with summaries. A question that once pointed toward mystery now loops back into templates. Why do I feel this way becomes, how do I stop feeling this way? We shift the focus from meaning to management, from exploration to control. But underneath the routines and updates and lists, why still knocks? Not loudly, just enough to make the silence feel heavier. There's an ache that comes from never asking, a slow internal narrowing, a shrinking of the inner landscape. You begin to move only where there are signs. You begin to trust only what can be measured. You begin to forget the taste of wonder. You still go through the motions. You still smile and nod. You still consume explanations. But deep down, you start to feel like something essential has been left behind. Not a belief, a muscle, the one that flexes in the dark and says, "What if this isn't it? What if the truth is stranger? What if the purpose is something we forgot to name?" The day we stopped asking why, we gained many things: efficiency, clarity, momentum. But we lost something too. We lost the open door. The door that never promised answers, only possibilities. The door that creaked a little every time we felt the presence of something larger than comprehension. The door that didn't lead anywhere in particular, just away from the illusion of completeness. You might remember asking why as a child and being told, "Because I said so." You might remember asking why again and hearing, "That's just the way it is." And maybe eventually you stopped asking, not because the answer satisfied you, but because the silence afterward made you feel foolish for needing one. That's how the extinction begins. Not with punishment, with indifference. We learn that some questions are impolite, that the hunger for meaning is embarrassing, that adults have no time for mystery, that philosophy is impractical, that feelings are inefficient, that asking why too often makes you look lost. So we pretend we are found. We dress up our confusion in certainty. We wear knowing like armor, even when it itches. We memorize scripts and avoid eye contact with our own doubt. But some part of us remembers. The part that still slows down when it rains. The part that still stares too long at candlelight. The part that wonders where music comes from, before the instruments, before the notes. Asking why was never about reaching a conclusion. It was about staying open, letting the question change you, letting it deepen the experience rather than end it. Because real questions don't close doors. They reveal that the hallway goes on forever. So why did we stop? Maybe because why doesn't produce. Maybe because it doesn't soothe. Maybe because it has no end. And in a world obsessed with finishing things, that's terrifying. But maybe we can remember, not in grand declarations, not in debates or dogma, in the smallest of moments. When someone tells you a fact, and instead of nodding, you ask what it means to them. When a headline demands outrage, and instead of reacting, you ask what it's distracting you from. When your own mood rises or falls and you pause, not to fix it, but to sit with it and wonder, why does this matter to me? This is not indulgence, it's restoration. Asking why is not about unraveling everything you know. It's about staying human in the presence of things that want to turn you into a function. It's the pulse beneath poetry, the tremor before every revolution, the gaze that turns survival into soul. And you don't need to know the answer, you just need to ask. Not to escape, but to remember that you are not made of algorithms, you are not optimized. You are not here to complete tasks until silence. You are here to wonder. You are here to ask why, even if the answer never comes. Especially then. Because wonder is not a weakness. It's what kept you alive before you knew how to name things. It's what lets you breathe in a world trying to smother nuance. It's what cracks open the smooth surface of belief and lets light in. So the question still waits, like an old friend at the edge of a dream, like a key on a table you forgot you owned. You can reach for it again. You don't need a reason, just a breath, just a moment of stillness, just the soft voice inside that never stopped whispering, "Why not?" There was a time when the moment was enough, when plans were vague and destinations were optional, when laughter erupted without prompting, when detours were not errors, but invitations, when the day wasn't scripted down to the half hour, when you could change your mind and it wouldn't be called inconsistent. Spontaneity was once a pulse, a current beneath everything. You felt it in the way a conversation wandered, in the way an afternoon could become a story, in the way the unknown tasted more like freedom than fear. Now we schedule freedom, we pencil in joy, we set reminders to breathe, we arrange spontaneity into windows, 45 minutes of unstructured time between structured tasks, and we call this balance. But spontaneity does not ask permission. It doesn't wait for context. It arrives like weather, and it used to be allowed. But now, everything must be justified, tracked, archived, shared. Spontaneity doesn't survive under surveillance. It dies when observed too closely. We killed it softly, not out of malice, out of momentum, out of calendars that fill before we notice, out of apps that remind us how efficient we're being, out of routines mistaken for safety, out of a culture that taught us the unplanned is unproductive. That deviation is danger, that every moment must serve a goal. So the unscripted moments began to vanish, the walk that turns into a 3-hour conversation, the song that rewrites your afternoon, the impulse to dance when no one's watching, the sudden change of route that leads to something unnamed. These moments don't appear in data. They don't track well. They can't be predicted or monetized. So we stopped valuing them, and slowly they disappeared. What replaced them wasn't wrong. It was neat. It was optimized. It was manageable. We mastered the art of living efficiently. But something in us began to stiffen. Not the body, the soul. Because spontaneity is not just an event. It's a relationship with time. It's the ability to say yes before the brain interrupts. It's trust in your own shifting rhythm. It's permission to not know what comes next. And we don't trust that anymore. We fill the blank spaces before they can speak. We default to patterns because they feel like control. We scroll instead of wander. We rehearse instead of respond. But life in its truest form resists rehearsal. You can feel the difference. In a conversation that spirals with unexpected honesty versus one that sticks to talking points. In a trip where you let the weather choose your direction versus one dictated by itinerary. In a day where one choice leads to 100 others versus a checklist that ends in exhaustion. Spontaneity is not chaos. It is rhythm unconfined. It is intuition unsilenced. It is the body remembering how to move without waiting for permission from the mind. But it requires something we've forgotten how to offer: presence. You cannot be spontaneous in a mind 5 steps ahead. You cannot leap if you are busy measuring the fall. You cannot play if the outcome already owns you. Spontaneity dies in futures we haven't reached but already fear. And it dies again in memories we curate before they're even made. You take a photo before the feeling has finished. You write the caption while the moment is still unfolding. You narrate the experience as if someone else is watching, even when they aren't. When every moment becomes content, every gesture becomes calculation, and in that calculation, spontaneity suffocates. But it doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. It shows up in half-decisions, in instinct that never makes it past hesitation, in invitations declined not because you didn't want to go, but because it wasn't on your calendar. We call this adulthood. We call this responsibility. But sometimes it's just fear dressed up as discipline, fear of the unstructured, fear of the vulnerable, fear of the self that acts before thinking, because that self is unpredictable. And unpredictability is hard to market, hard to manage, hard to measure. But it's also where aliveness lives. The greatest connections you've had probably began with a moment you didn't plan. The most vivid memories likely began with a change of course. The times you felt most yourself weren't when everything made sense, but when something unexpected broke through routine. That is what we bury when we stop allowing spontaneity, not just excitement, but ourselves. The version of you that doesn't fit neatly in your schedule. The one that forgets time when it plays. The one that improvises truth instead of reciting it. The one that can still be surprised. That version hasn't died. It's just waiting for silence, for stillness, for an open afternoon, for a no that turns into a yes, for a plan you choose not to follow. And when it comes, when the door opens and something unplanned enters, what will you do? Will you resist it, or will you let the moment change you? Not because it's wise, not because it's useful, but because it's alive. That's the essence of spontaneity, a flash of the unfiltered self, untethered from prediction, unbothered by approval. And in a world that fears what it cannot forecast, that is a radical act. To live not for outcome, but for presence. To act not from habit, but from instinct. To say yes without a reason. Not always, not recklessly, just often enough to remember that you are not a program. You are possibility. Let that be enough. Let the moment be a doorway again. Let your soul stretch beyond your schedule. Let something unexpected lead you home. But spontaneity, like language, fades when unused. It stiffens into hesitation. You begin to second-guess the impulse to turn left instead of right, to call someone without a reason, to start a sentence before knowing how it ends. You wait for a better time, a clearer signal, a more convenient moment. And the moment passes again and again and again. Eventually, you begin to forget you ever moved without instruction. That once, you trusted the unplanned not as risk but as revelation. You were not always so rehearsed. You once said what you meant before, deciding how it would sound. You once followed a sudden idea just to see where it led. You once made something messy, not to display it, but to feel what it felt like to make. You once danced without recording. You once left without telling anyone. You once loved without calculating the distance between you. And maybe, even now, something in you wants that again. Not the chaos, not recklessness, just aliveness. The pulse beneath a spontaneous act that says, I am here. I don't need a reason. The world will not give this back to you. It will offer plans, systems, versions of yourself with outcomes and branding. But beneath it all, spontaneity waits, not to be scheduled, not to be justified, only to be chosen. So let the small impulse live. Let one moment today be unscripted. Let one sentence begin before you know where it ends. Let one breath belong only to the present. And feel it, the flicker of something long quiet. The self that moves like wind, alive again. It doesn't happen all at once. You still cry at the right moments. You still say, "That must have been hard," when someone tells you their story. You still laugh. You still say you're excited. You still post the heart emoji, the flame, the clapping hands. You still reply with, "That's amazing," or "So proud of you," or "Ugh, same." But something is missing. Not the language of feeling, but the feeling itself. The raw, undressed presence of it. The way sadness used to feel like weather, rolling in with its own scent and weight. The way joy once had texture, a color behind the ribs. The way awe could still your breath without explanation. Now it arrives thinner, filtered, and often not at all. We forget to feel, not by choice, but by drift. First, we learn to name emotions before we experience them. We label the feeling before we listen to it. We check the word against a chart. We self-diagnose. We use phrases like emotional processing and trigger response before we let the feeling fully land. Then we learn to regulate, which means control, which means reduce, which means bury. We forget that some emotions aren't meant to be managed. They're meant to burn, to break something, to wake something. But we've been taught that feeling is dangerous if it isn't tidy. We keep the edges smooth. We train ourselves to talk about the feeling instead of letting it speak. And soon, the language replaces the sensation. You describe the grief, but you don't cry. You tell the story of the heartbreak, but your body doesn't flinch. You say, "I'm overwhelmed," and then you keep going, keep scrolling, keep performing. The architecture of your feelings remains, but the rooms are empty. And still, on the outside, you appear functional, calm, capable, focused. People thank you for being steady. You thank yourself for being resilient. But under that steadiness is silence, a waiting, a pressure, a self you've left behind in the name of stability. This is not numbness, not yet. This is the beginning of forgetting. We forget to feel when feeling stops being safe, when every expression becomes content, when tears are branded as vulnerability and shared like strategy, when anger is edited into poetry and despair becomes a punchline, when nothing can stay raw, it must be rendered. So we render ourselves, in posts, in performances, in polished explanations that distance us from the truth. But feelings are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be felt. A tremor in the gut, a heat in the face, a collapse in the chest, a silence that isn't peace but pressure. These are not problems to be solved. They are signals, not of failure, but of being alive. Yet we treat them like glitches. We apologize for crying. We dismiss our excitement with a joke. We flatten our rage into a measured response. We translate everything we feel into language that will not threaten the listener. And slowly the signal fades. Feeling becomes something that happens later, when it's convenient, when it's useful, when we're alone. But emotion does not wait. It collects. It clogs the unspoken places. It lives in your jaw, your shoulders, your sleep. It waits in your stomach until it turns into something else. Fatigue, illness, absence, and even then we don't feel it. We call it burnout. We call it stress. We call it a lot right now. We forget that what we are avoiding is not life, it is response. The body's honest reply to what the soul can't keep carrying alone. But the longer we delay, the harder it becomes to remember how. Because feeling is not thought. It cannot be summoned through analysis. You cannot logic your way into grief. You cannot reason your way into joy. You must enter it, and that is terrifying. Because real feeling is not controlled. It dismantles. It moves without permission. It might ruin your plans, but it might also return you to yourself. You once knew how. As a child, you cried when you needed to. You laughed without asking if it made sense. You got angry in full color before you learned how to apologize for being too much. You loved without strategy. And then the world began to correct you. You were told to toughen up, to tone it down, to grow up, to manage your feelings, to put things into perspective, to get over it, to stop making it about you, to be strong, to move on. And so you learned to adjust. You built filters between the moment and the self. You became articulate. You became reasonable. You became someone who doesn't feel too much. And you forgot. You forgot that anger is not cruelty, that sadness is not weakness, that joy doesn't need to be earned, that fear is not failure. You forgot that feeling is not the enemy, it is the message. And now it's time to remember, not by forcing it, not by making a list, but by softening, by noticing, by letting yourself feel one thing fully without rushing to reframe it. Let yourself cry without translating. Let yourself be angry without apologizing. Let yourself feel joy without documenting. Let yourself ache without numbing. Because feeling is not a detour. It is the map. It brings you back to the body, to the breath, to the present, to the truth beneath the story. And maybe it hurts, maybe it breaks something, maybe it overwhelms. But what is broken can heal. What is overwhelming can pass. What is buried cannot transform. Let it come, not all at once, but enough to remind you that you are still here, still capable of weeping without explanation, still capable of trembling in the face of beauty, still capable of being undone, still capable of becoming. You don't need permission. You don't need a reason. You only need to stop, to feel what is already waiting beneath the silence, to let it move through. Because you haven't lost the ability. You've only forgotten the way. And memory returns in a moment, in a breath, in a tear not swallowed, in the courage to not edit what arises. Feel now, before forgetting becomes the only thing you know how to do. It begins as a flicker, nothing tragic, nothing noticeable. You pick up the phone without meaning to. Your thumb moves before you remember you have a body, a glance, a scroll, a silent loop. You're not searching for anything in particular. You're just looking, but looking becomes staying. Staying becomes sinking, and sinking becomes forgetting. Not forgetting facts, forgetting feeling, forgetting hunger, forgetting rest, forgetting your name in the silence. The scroll is soft, gentle, unassuming, but it does not give. It takes. It takes time first, then presence, then selfhood. And still, you scroll. Because what else is there to do? Stillness now feels like absence, like failure, like falling behind. You wake and the first light isn't dawn. It's a screen. You reach for it before you breathe. Not because it matters, but because it's there. The scroll doesn't demand. It seduces. It offers infinity wrapped in flickers. Content, they call it. A word that once meant satisfaction now means noise. You tell yourself it's harmless, just a few minutes, just catching up, just checking in. But you're not checking in, you're checking out. Each swipe is a tiny exhale of attention, each loop a small rehearsal of absence. And you wonder why the world feels thin, why your thoughts scatter, why your words lose shape the moment you try to write them. It's not that you're lost. You've been displaced, pixel by pixel. The scroll is not evil, it's frictionless, and what slips without friction slips without notice. You don't feel yourself wither, you just feel tired, not exhausted, frayed. You try to focus but can't. You try to feel but nothing lands. You try to remember what it was like before, but the memory is blurred by static. Once you stood in lines and stared at nothing. Once you waited without input. Once you let boredom unfold into imagination. Now the void is filled before it forms. You do not remember your last thought uninterrupted. You do not remember the last time you were alone in your mind long enough to feel uncomfortable. But it is that discomfort, raw and unsolved, that used to lead somewhere. Into questions, into creativity, into the strange, unnameable things that only arise when you are not distracted. Now the scroll stands in the doorway. You carry it into every room. You take it into bed like a lover. You touch it more than you touch your own skin, and it begins to shape you, not with force, with patterns. The cadence of the scroll becomes the cadence of the mind. Fast, shallow, hungry, swipe, glimpse, forget. Even beauty becomes something to consume, not inhabit. Awe lasts 3 seconds before it's replaced. Outrage expires within the hour. Grief is buried beneath 10 new jokes. There is no space to land, only drift. And in the drift, the soul forgets how to root. You stop anchoring to anything that takes more than a minute to unfold. You stop trusting what cannot be condensed. You stop believing in depth. This is how withering happens, not through starvation, through overstimulation. Too much, too fast, too often, until even silence becomes intolerable. But here's the secret the scroll hides. It gives you the illusion of everything while keeping you from anything. You learn, but don't retain. You laugh, but don't remember why. You react, but never reflect. You keep moving, but never arrive. And you begin to forget that you ever needed to. You stop writing things that take longer than a caption. You stop reading past the first sentence. You stop listening all the way to the end. You stop dreaming in full sentences. And still, the scroll continues, endless, restless, bottomless, the well that never nourishes, the feed that never satisfies. Because what you're seeking isn't more information, it's presence. And presence cannot be swiped into. It must be returned to, slowly, like a language you forgot you could speak. So what happens when you stop? What happens when you put the scroll down before the app decides you're done? At first it hurts. The mind twitches, the hunger rises, you feel the empty like a weight. You feel the silence like a bruise. But then something stirs. A thought, unsponsored, a memory, full length, a feeling whole and uncaptioned. And for a moment you remember. This is what it means to be a mind not marketed, a self not interrupted, a consciousness not under construction. You breathe differently. You hear yourself again. The room regains its dimensions, your skin its texture, your thoughts their rhythm. There is nothing profound in this pause, only something essential, a reorientation. You are not a content machine. You are not a vessel for reaction. You are not made to be efficient. You are not here to be constantly updated. You are here to feel, to notice, to dwell, to listen long enough for stillness to speak. And stillness does speak, but only when the scroll ends. So tonight, try this. Set it down before it begs. Look away before you're full. Let the discomfort rise, and don't soothe it. Let the silence come and don't fill it. Let the ache for input pass through you. And when it does, beneath the noise, beneath the blur, beneath the script of modern attention, you may find something untouched, a mind returning to itself, a soul remembering how to land, a self no longer withering, but waking. But waking is not instant, it's not clean, it's not euphoric, it stumbles, it stings. Because once the scroll is gone, what's left is you, unbuffered. The thoughts you postponed, the emotions you silenced, the loneliness you dressed in distraction. They don't disappear. They wait, and they arrive with questions. Where have you been? Why did you leave me? Why did you trade the ache of presence for the numbness of motion? You won't have good answers, but presence doesn't require an apology, only attention. So you sit, at first for seconds, then longer. You resist the twitch to reach. You breathe through the static. You relearn how to look at nothing until something ancient stirs, a spark, a pull, a flicker of memory that belongs only to you. Unshared, unscrolled, unfiltered. This is how the self restores. Not in some grand detox, not in digital martyrdom, but in small refusals. The refusal to let every silence be filled. The refusal to reduce experience to a post. The refusal to trade aliveness for novelty. And slowly something roots. You begin to feel time again, not as a threat, as a field, something you can walk through instead of outrun. You begin to hear your thoughts arrive in full shape, uncut. You begin to remember that being human was never meant to be endless input. It was meant to be depth, stillness, a moment that holds you without needing to be updated. Let this be that moment. You can return to the scroll later. But for now, be where your hands are. Be what your breath is doing. Be the space that was always yours. Beneath the noise, beneath the blur, becoming whole again. There was a time when friendship asked for nothing. You showed up, you listened, you laughed at things that weren't funny just because the moment felt warm. You stayed on the phone in silence. You shared a drink, a walk, a song. It didn't matter if the plans were vague. It didn't matter if the time was productive. You weren't measuring. You were just there. But somewhere along the way, presence began to feel insufficient. Time became currency, attention became strategy, conversations became negotiations. The unspoken question began to hang between every message. What are we getting out of this? Friendship, once spontaneous and open-ended, began to harden into structure, into metrics, into terms, into usefulness. You notice it first in the way people respond, not to you, but to your value. How many followers you have, how quickly you reply, how well you align with their goals. The connection feels real, but something in it is conditional. There's a subtle bartering behind the warmth, a rhythm of exchange, a calibration of effort. You begin to measure yourself, too. You ask whether reaching out will feel like neediness. You hesitate before sharing something vulnerable, wondering if it's worth the emotional cost. You assess the energy balance before confiding. You keep tabs, not out of resentment, but habit. And the heart of friendship, its unscripted generosity, begins to erode. It's not malicious, it's not even conscious. It's the slow seep of transactionality into everything. In a world of branding, positioning, networking, optimizing, friendship, too, becomes part of the system. You offer updates instead of emotions. You send memes instead of meaning. You connect instead of sit. You check in like it's a task. You keep things brief, polished, pleasing. And still something feels missing. It's not that your friends are unkind. It's that everyone seems tired, guarded, curated, too busy to be present, too overstimulated to listen deeply. There's always somewhere else to be, another conversation to have, another message to respond to. And the ones you're in don't quite land. They skim. Because transaction by nature skims. It touches, but it doesn't hold. It nods, but doesn't pause. It hears, but doesn't stay. And when friendship turns transactional, staying becomes rare. You feel it when the conversation only flows one way, when your presence is only valued when it's needed, when your silence is noticed not with concern but inconvenience, when being known becomes something you have to earn. It wasn't always like this. You once had friends who knew you beyond your performance, who saw your rough drafts, who didn't mind your mess, who stayed after the party, after the laughter, after the silence. But now something's shifted. Now it's about timing, about branding your struggles so they're palatable, about making sure your vulnerability has a point. Friendship becomes a mirror for success. And if your life doesn't reflect light, it doesn't get seen. You learn to edit yourself, to withhold the parts that might make others uncomfortable, to perform closeness instead of risking it. You adapt, and slowly you forget what real presence feels like. Real presence isn't efficient. It isn't always pleasant. It doesn't always look good in photos. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's inconvenient. Sometimes it's just there, unremarkable and sacred. But the transactional mind doesn't see value in what can't be counted. It wants output. It wants evidence. It wants ROI on every interaction. And so friendship becomes another tool for access, for comfort, for utility. The soul starves beneath that. Because friendship isn't a service. It's not meant to be productive. It's not a project. It's a space. A place where the self can unfold without being marketed. A place where silence isn't awkward. Where showing up empty-handed is enough. But the world trains us otherwise. To compete, to monetize, to optimize every relationship. We're praised for being good communicators, but often that just means being able to package emotions in appealing ways. We're encouraged to network, as if the word friend was just a more sentimental version of resource. And slowly we internalize it, even when we don't mean to, even when we ache for something deeper, even when our heart still knows what real friendship is, because it does. It remembers. It remembers nights that ended in laughter without punchlines. It remembers eyes that saw through your silence. It remembers sitting next to someone and feeling no pressure to entertain. It remembers being known, not for your wins, but for your weird. That memory still lives inside you. It's why the shallow connection stings, why the delayed reply hurts more than it should, why the constant "let's catch up soon" begins to feel like a ghost promise, why you ache for something that feels extinct. But maybe it's not extinct. Maybe it's just waiting for permission, for someone to say, "You don't have to be useful here. You don't have to be impressive. You don't have to be on. You can just come as you are, unpolished, unfiltered, untransactional." And maybe that someone can be you. Maybe you can show up first. Maybe you can stop keeping score. Maybe you can call just to say hello and stay when the silence comes. Maybe you can let friendship be messy again. Maybe you can offer presence without needing purpose, and let others do the same. Not everyone will meet you there. Some will stay in the language of exchange. Some will forget how to rest with others. Some will leave when the mask slips. But a few won't. A few will exhale. A few will remember too. And in that remembering, something sacred returns. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like a room being lived in again. Because real friendship doesn't ask, "What can you give me?" It asks, "Who are you when nothing is required?" And that question, the one asked with no expectation, might be the only real beginning. Somewhere along the way, the mirror stopped recognizing you. It still reflected, still showed you a face, still offered symmetry and light. But it no longer held you, not the way it used to, not with memory, not with meaning, just surface. Every morning the ritual repeats, eyes, teeth, angles, lighting. You check yourself, not to see yourself, but to monitor, to ensure consistency, to verify that the image still performs the role it's been given. But the mirror has forgotten who you are. And, quietly, so have you. You used to look for signs of change. A new freckle, a tiredness in the eyes, a softness, a sharpness, a question in the face. You used to stare at your reflection and feel something ancient, recognition, even if it was complicated. No, you glance, you adjust, you move on. This is not vanity, it is erasure, because the mirror that forgets is not glass. It's the mirror of attention, the mirror of feedback, the mirror of digital identity, the mirror that shows you only what you already know how to curate. And slowly, it stops reflecting the self. It reflects the role. You become an image of yourself, selfies as signposts, profiles as proxies, your reflection flattened to fit what others can accept, endorse, approve. And the soul behind the face begins to recede, not because it's weak, because it's not meant to be seen in glass, because the soul is built in silence, in memory, in the thousand small moments that pass without record. But the mirror now requires performance. It does not remember you as you were. It remembers the last time you looked good, the last time you matched expectations, the last time the lighting flattered the narrative. And so you begin to perform. Even alone, you hold your face like a mask. You move through the world in a posture curated for others. You walk into rooms wondering what version of you is most legible, most acceptable, most marketable. And the deeper self, the one that forgets how to pose, fades into blur. This is not about insecurity, it's about disconnection. You no longer see yourself because there's nothing to anchor to. The mirror reflects now without memory. It doesn't remember who you were yesterday. It doesn't remember the way your face used to look when you were lost in thought. It doesn't remember the part of you that can't be styled. And you begin to wonder, did I change or just dissolve into expectation? There is grief in this, a soft grief, the kind that whispers, not screams, because identity was never meant to be watched. It was meant to be lived. Messy, unfiltered, repeating in strange, imperfect patterns, held not by glass, but by presence, by people who knew you before you needed to explain yourself, by memory, not measurement. But now we are watched too often, too publicly, too constantly, and so we edit. And the editing becomes instinct, and the instinct becomes the new self. You lose the version of you that frowns in thought, the one that dances without recording, the one that laughs without checking the angle, the one that wakes up disoriented and doesn't reach for their image. You become coherent, but hollow, and the mirror keeps reflecting, keeps showing you something familiar, keeps telling you, this is you. But the you it shows has no memory, no depth, no contradiction, just now, just surface, just approval. And so the self begins to feel unreal, because to feel real, you must feel continuous. You must see the thread. You must know that who you are today is built from who you were before. But when every day is a reset, a new post, a fresh take, a curated moment, you forget the through line. You become fragments, highlight reels, snippets and slogans, each one reflecting well but connecting poorly. This is what the mirror does when it forgets. It offers clarity without truth, a perfect image that means nothing, a sense of self that slips the moment you stop performing. But there is a way back. It begins not by smashing the mirror, but by refusing to ask it who you are, by turning your attention inward, not in judgment, but in remembering. Remember the face you made when no one was watching. Remember how you looked when you didn't know how to pose. Remember the softness that arrived when you were lost in music. Remember the way you smiled as a child. Not for the camera, but because something inside you bloomed. These are the memories the mirror cannot hold. They live elsewhere, in sensation, in breath, in presence. They return when you stop curating and start dwelling. When you spend time with yourself not to improve, but to witness. When you let your face fall into honesty instead of symmetry. When you catch your own gaze in a window and don't flinch. This is how the soul begins to return. Not in image, but in rhythm. The rhythm of thought unfiltered. The rhythm of memory unbranded. The rhythm of a life not made for display. And slowly, the mirror becomes less necessary. Because you stop needing reflection to feel real. You stop asking your image to confirm your worth. You stop letting strangers decide which version of you deserves attention. You remember that who you are isn't a snapshot, it's a story. And stories aren't always photogenic. They're layered, contradictory, evolving. So let the mirror forget. It was never meant to hold you. Let it show the surface. Let it be what it is. And then turn away, not from yourself, but toward the parts that no one sees, toward the gestures you don't record, the thoughts you don't narrate, the memories no algorithm can retrieve. This is where the self rebuilds, where depth returns, where the reflection softens into truth. Not because the image has changed, but because you are no longer trying to be seen. You are remembering how to be. When was it? The last time you were truly, uncomfortably, gloriously bored. Not the kind of boredom disguised by distraction, waiting in line while checking your phone, sitting through a meeting while mentally reorganizing your day. Not the polished kind, where a blank moment is instantly smoothed by streaming, scrolling, swiping. No, the real kind, the kind that stretches time, the kind that feels like emptiness yawning open, the kind that makes you restless, irritable, irrational, the kind you were once forced to sit with before you were given 1,000 tiny windows out of it. That kind of boredom was once a daily visitor. It knocked at the door when the weather was dull, when no one called, when the hours passed like ghosts. And for a while you hated it. But something grew there, something wild and unscripted, a thought that hadn't been prompted, a drawing that came from nowhere, a walk that turned into a story, a silence that stretched until it broke open into laughter. Boredom wasn't absence. It was an invitation. It held the space that creativity needed to breathe. It was the quiet that gave birth to wondering. Now, boredom is nearly extinct. We've banished it proudly. We carry entire theaters in our pockets. We fill every gap with sound. We call it convenience, but something in us has tightened. Our tolerance for stillness has withered. We check our phones at red lights, during meals, in elevators, while brushing our teeth. We are never truly alone with our own minds. The moment space opens, we panic. Not consciously, not dramatically, but as reflex. The itch to fill the void comes faster than the awareness of the void itself. And so we fill it. Not because the content matters, but because emptiness feels unbearable. But in killing boredom, we have killed the soil that used to grow our imagination. We have short-circuited the daydream, the long stare, the shapeless thought that becomes something only when it has room to stretch. We have gained endless entertainment and lost our own interiority. Because boredom was never the enemy. It was a doorway, a gentle pressure that led inward, a space where the mind began to speak in its own voice again, not repeating or reacting, but inventing. In boredom, you remembered things you didn't know you had forgotten. In boredom, your thoughts wandered off script. It wasn't always pleasant, but it was yours. And now, when people say they feel uninspired, what they often mean is, I haven't been bored in a long time. I haven't sat still long enough for something original to form. I haven't let the silence teach me anything. So the next time boredom arrives, let it. Don't fix it. Don't feed it. Don't outrun it. Let it open. Let it stretch. Let it lead you past the edge of what you already know. because the last time you were bored might also have been the last time you were fully present, unguarded, unprompted, unfinished, and perhaps that wasn't boredom at all. Perhaps that was simply life, unfilled, and waiting for you to return. But returning is difficult. Boredom has become taboo in a culture that worships stimulation. To be bored now feels like a failure of imagination, a laziness of spirit, a personal defect in a world of infinite input. You're expected to be always engaged, always on, always reacting, updating, refining, producing. Even your rest must be purposeful, mindful, optimized, aesthetically pleasing. There is no space for dullness, no room for stillness without function. The idle moment is treated like rot, something to fix, something to fear. But this fear has come at a cost. You no longer remember how to just be in the in-between. You reach for your phone before your thought finishes forming. You open tabs before the last one is read. You respond to messages without pausing to feel whether you have anything to say. You are not moving through life anymore. You are clicking through it. Yet deep within you, something remembers what came before the scroll. There is a version of you, sleeping perhaps, that once wandered through an afternoon without knowing what would happen. Who once lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling and let the mind meander like a lazy river. That version did not crave efficiency. It was not anxious to escape itself. It trusted time to unfold, trusted boredom to bloom into something subtle and strange. Because boredom is not a void, it is pressure. It is the mind knocking at the edges of a life too full of other people's thoughts. It is your own voice asking to be heard again. And it rarely speaks in urgency. It speaks in repetition, in fidgeting, in discomfort. It asks you to stay through the itch, through the silence, through the awkwardness of not knowing what's next. And what comes next may be nothing at all or everything, because when you stay long enough in boredom, it begins to change shape. It turns into memory. It turns into a question. It turns into a thread of thought that winds itself into a feeling you haven't named in years. This is where stories begin. This is where intuition sharpens. This is where the parts of you that have been flattened by algorithms begin to unfold again. Not for show, not for performance. For you. And boredom, true boredom, is the gatekeeper of that unfolding. It filters out the noise. It demands presence. It dares you to go inward when the world says, stay distracted. It is not convenient. It is not comfortable. But it is honest. And in that honesty, you might finally begin to remember what your mind sounds like when it's not echoing someone else's content. So allow yourself to be bored, not as an indulgence but as a practice. Let the day pass without purpose. Let a moment stretch longer than it should. Let your hand hover before you reach for the next thing. Notice how quickly your instincts scream for relief. Notice how rarely you're alone with yourself. And stay anyway. Stay with the nothing. Stay until the nothing becomes something. Stay until the thought returns. Stay until your mind remembers that it is not an empty vessel for information, but a well, deep, untended, and waiting to be drawn from again. You do not need stimulation to feel alive. You need space. You need silence. You need time that is not borrowed. You need boredom, not as punishment, but as permission, because maybe the last time you were bored was the last time you were free. There are questions you once carried like treasures, not for their answers, but for the way they opened you. quiet ones, strange ones, the kind that tugged at the edge of your sleep. What makes a moment real? Where does a thought go when it's forgotten? Who would I be if no one ever knew my name? You didn't ask them to be clever. You asked them because they haunted you, because they hovered in the silence between things. But over time, they were set down, not decisively, not with ceremony, just left behind, replaced by more answerable things. Practical questions, useful questions, questions with data and steps and metrics. You didn't even notice the trade, only that something in you had grown quieter. Abandoned questions don't vanish, they settle. They live in the soft corners of the mind, the places untouched by routine. They become the tension in your chest when everything is fine. They become the strange ache when you finish a project but feel no relief. They become the vague sadness that arrives after success. Not because anything is wrong, but because nothing asks anymore. You've become an expert at solving problems, but you've forgotten how to dwell in mystery. You no longer kneel before the unknown. You analyze it, categorize it, explain it away. And in doing so, you've lost something ancient, the part of you that once followed a thought, not to find its end, but to wander its terrain. The part that knew some questions are meant to be kept, not answered. But abandoned doesn't mean dead. Some questions wait. For silence, for stillness, for the moment when efficiency cracks and something softer seeps through. A moment in the dark, or the middle of the night, or in the quiet after being heard. And there, like a familiar echo, they return. Do I know who I am without the things I do? What was I before I became understandable? They arrive not to be solved, but to remind you, you are not a machine of conclusions. You are a mystery with a pulse. And some questions are holy because they have no answer, only presence. But presence is something we've forgotten how to hold. We are taught to treat questions like doorways with destinations, not corridors meant for wandering. From the moment we learn to speak, we are rewarded for answers. Right ones, fast ones, useful ones. The child who asks, why, again and again becomes exhausting. The adult who does the same is labeled lost, indecisive, inefficient. So we learn to trade wonder for certainty, to present polished thoughts instead of tangled ones, to abandon the questions that lead nowhere visible. But some truths do not live in the visible. Some questions were never meant to be answered, only inhabited. They are the spaces where identity is not fixed but felt, where belief loosens its grip, where the self dissolves and reforms, stranger, softer, more real. What becomes of a mind that only seeks conclusions? It sharpens, it organizes, it becomes powerful but brittle. Like glass, it can cut, it can reflect, but it cannot bend. A life built on only solvable questions becomes a life made of walls. You always know where you are, but you stop moving. You mistake answers for foundations when they were only stepping stones meant to crumble once passed. That is what abandoned questions remind you, that some structures are not homes, they're holding patterns, that growth does not always look like clarity, that to evolve is to sit with uncertainty long enough that it begins to sound like music instead of noise. And the questions are still humming. They hum when you watch someone you love walk away, and the ache doesn't fit into words. They hum when you wake in the middle of the night with the sense that something's missing, but you don't know what. They hum when you stare at the ceiling, at the clouds, at the mirror, and the surface doesn't answer back. They hum when the job is done, but the soul feels empty. They hum when the room is full, but you still feel unseen. Questions like, is this all there is? Who am I performing for? What did I trade for stability? Am I building a life I actually want, or one I know how to explain? They rise like old friends, knocking without demand. They do not need solving, they need staying. Staying is hard. It's easier to scroll, to Google, to ask someone else to tell you. But no one can hold your abandoned questions for you. They are keys that only fit the lock of your own silence. And when you finally turn the key, not for resolution, but for return, you may feel foolish, vulnerable, like a beginner again. That's how you know the question is real. Real questions make you softer. They undo what ego has fortified. They bring you back into contact with the part of yourself that exists before the role, before the script, before the brand. The part that still wonders, still grieves, still listens. That part does not thrive on answers. It thrives on sincerity. It thrives on presence. In a world obsessed with speed, there is nothing more subversive than taking time to not know. So reclaim your abandoned questions. Let them clutter your journal. Let them whisper while you wash the dishes. Let them sit beside you on the train. Let them interrupt your polished answers. Let them open small portals in the ordinary. Let them change nothing, and in doing so, change everything. Because maybe the point was never to find the answer, but to become the kind of person who can hold the question without running away. Maybe the question is the home. Maybe the uncertainty is the invitation. And maybe, just maybe, what you thought was lost was simply waiting for you to ask again. There is a light inside you. It was never loud, never blinding, never designed to draw attention. It flickered quietly behind the eyes. A gentle, glowing sense of rightness, not because life made sense, but because something in you still responded to it. You felt it in the quiet between words, in the moment just before choosing, in the space where the world hadn't told you what to think yet. This light wasn't confidence, it wasn't clarity, it was intuition, a silent lantern carried within, and it guided you, not through certainty but through resonance. You followed what felt true, even when you couldn't explain it. You moved toward people, ideas, places that hummed with something familiar. You trusted the glimmer. You believed at the compass of your own soul. But somewhere along the path, the light began to dim, not all at once, not with a sudden extinguishing. It happened slowly, like dust settling on a lens. Each time you dismissed a feeling as irrational, each time you explained yourself out of wonder, each time you overrode discomfort because it wasn't convenient, each time someone told you what you should want, and you nodded because it was easier than pausing. The lantern didn't go out, it just got quieter, and the world, ever noisy, rushed in to fill the silence. Soon you found yourself moving in ways that no longer aligned with your center. You said yes when your body said no. You stayed when your spirit said, leave. You kept performing the self that made sense to others, even as something deeper began to recoil. But you told yourself this was maturity. This was compromise. This was how the real world works. And the light dimmed further. You began to mistrust the parts of you that did not speak the language of logic. You called them mood swings. You called them overreactions. You called them irrelevant. You began to outsource your knowing to experts, algorithms, crowds. If enough people agreed, it must be right. If it looked good on paper, it must be meant for you. If the path was well lit by others, why bother checking the faint glow beneath your ribs? And so you moved further and further from yourself. You followed the map and ignored the compass. You followed plans instead of pulls. And you were praised for it. Praised for being so adaptable, so agreeable, so directed. No one could see that something inside you had gone quiet, that the voice you used to trust now spoke in a whisper you barely heard. But even dimmed, the lantern never disappears. It waits, it flickers in the presence of certain moments. The way a scent pulls you into a memory, or a song reminds you of a dream you once carried. It flares up in moments of alignment. In the book you didn't plan to read but couldn't put down. In the friend who understands your silence. In the decision you made that no one else understood, but somehow felt right in your bones. These are the signals, the clues, the reminders that the light is still there, under the noise, waiting not for attention, but for permission, not for analysis, but for trust. Trust that you do know something, even if you don't know how to explain it. Trust that not every part of you is meant to be seen, validated, measured. Trust that the truest path often begins where logic falters. To let the lantern glow again, you don't need to change your life overnight. You don't need to burn it all down. You simply need to stop turning away. Begin by listening to the tug you ignored, the no you swallowed, the yes you never said out loud. Begin by being honest about what no longer fits, even if you're not ready to leave it yet. Begin by letting stillness speak before the world tells you what to want. This light does not shout. It does not command. It invites. And when you start following it, even in small steps, you begin to remember what alignment feels like, not as performance, but as peace. You begin to feel whole, not because everything is solved, but because something inside you has come back online. The lantern brightens not through answers, but through presence, through courage, through choosing again and again to honor what the world can't see, but what your soul never forgot. But asking again takes courage. The world has taught us that questions without answers are dangerous, evidence of indecision, of immaturity, of being ungrounded. We're told to move forward, to define our path, to become experts in our own becoming. And yet, the most important parts of who we are live in the questions we've been told to outgrow. What do I really want? What am I afraid to admit? What part of me have I never allowed to speak? These aren't signs of confusion. They are signs of depth. A soul still turning its soil. A life still willing to become something unmeasured. Abandoned questions are not lost. They're buried. Beneath deadlines, under noise, behind the polished language of someone who's learned how to be understood. But when silence returns, so do they. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in the pause before sleep, sometimes in the strange ache when a day feels full, but you feel empty. These questions re-emerge not to undo you, but to reunite you with the self you left behind in pursuit of certainty. They do not want quick answers. They want witness. They want space. They want your unguarded attention, not to resolve them, but to remember them, to carry them again, not as burdens, but as keys. So let the questions back in. Let them clutter your certainty. Let them rattle the safe edges of your routines. Let them take up room in your conversations, not as provocations, but as prayers. Because asking again is not regression, it's re-entry into the part of you that was never trying to arrive, only to feel, to understand what can't be said neatly, to trace the shape of meaning even if it disappears as you follow it. Life is not a test with a score. It is a sea of unresolvable wonder. And the questions you thought you outgrew may be the only parts of you still growing. They are not weaknesses, they are roots. And every time you ask again, you return to where your becoming began. Stillness has always waited for us, patient, unchanging, not the stillness of inactivity or sleep, but the stillness that lives beneath motion. A stillness older than breath, older than thought, older than time. It sits behind every heartbeat, beneath every spoken word, under every rush of doing. It doesn't demand, doesn't insist. It simply waits for us to remember how to be without becoming. But we never enter. We get close, perhaps, in the moments between things. When the light fades and no one is asking for anything, when the noise softens just enough to notice our own breath, when we lie awake before sleep, untethered, but even then we flinch, we reach for distraction, we scroll, we calculate, we narrate, we edit. Because stillness is not comfortable, it is honest, it does not flatter, it does not perform, it does not play along, it reflects, it holds up a mirror with no distortion. And in that clarity, something in us recoils. Because when you are still, you feel everything you've avoided, everything you've postponed, everything you've disguised as momentum. Stillness is terrifying not because it is empty, but because it is full. It holds every version of you you've abandoned. It holds the voice that was drowned out by urgency. It holds the ache you dressed in productivity. It holds the truth you were almost ready to feel. We say we want peace, but most of us seek it in pieces, in apps, in plans, in structured retreats. We sample calmness, but avoid the source. True stillness cannot be scheduled. It must be surrendered to. And surrender requires trust. Trust that you won't unravel. Trust that what emerges in silence will not undo you. But maybe undoing is exactly what is needed, because we build so much just to avoid the pause. We chase goals, stories, identities, anything to stay in motion, as if being still is a kind of failure, as if the world might forget us if we stop producing, as if we might forget ourselves. But stillness is not forgetting, it is remembering. In stillness, your breath becomes a message. In stillness, your thoughts stop arranging themselves for performance. In stillness, you hear the sadness behind your smile. You feel the hunger beneath your ambition. You notice the part of you that is tired of being strong. And maybe, for the first time, you let that part rest. Stillness does not solve. It does not fix. It does not narrate. It invites. It opens the locked room, the one where your younger self still waits, the one where your questions never needed to be answered, the one where you are not required to be anyone in particular. And that's the paradox of it. The place we avoid the most is the one that holds what we've been seeking. Stillness is not the opposite of action. It is the ground from which right action rises. When you enter it, truly enter, it does not feel passive. It feels like returning to gravity, like exhaling after years of holding your breath, like stepping out of a performance you didn't know you were still giving. And in that moment, things rearrange. Not because you forced them to, but because stillness revealed what never needed fixing in the first place. It softened the noise. It showed you what was already whole. But to reach this stillness, you must stop running, not just from the world, but from yourself. You must let the quiet in, even when it hums with discomfort. You must stay seated, even when every cell demands distraction. You must listen, not to the voice in your head, but to the one beneath it. This is not easy, but it is necessary. Because beneath your striving, beneath your story, beneath your goals and fears, there is a silence that knows your name, and it has never stopped calling you back. Back to the moment, back to presence, back to what you are when you stop trying to become. Stillness isn't something you enter by effort. It's something you return to by release. So let it come. Let the stillness fill the space you once filled with motion. Let it be the ground, the mirror, the friend, not to escape life, but to remember how to live it. But remembering how to live is harder than it sounds, because what we call life has been wrapped in noise. Our days, stitched together by alarms and alerts, feel full, but brittle. We wake into schedules, not silence. We move from task to task, conversation to screen, screen to thought, thought to worry. We measure ourselves in moments we rarely inhabit. Even rest becomes curated. Even solitude is interrupted. We are constantly in motion, yet rarely in presence. And somewhere deep within, a tension builds, not because we are doing too much, but because we are never truly still. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the presence of attention. It is the pause that reminds us we are not the noise we produce. It is the space in which we can hear the quiet voice beneath the choreography of performance. That voice doesn't speak in goals or strategies. It doesn't tell you who to become. It doesn't care about metrics. It asks simpler things. Are you listening? Are you here? Can you feel this breath, this moment, this body, this now? And yet we fear this voice, not because it lies, but because it doesn't flatter. It does not reinforce our masks. It reveals the weight of them, the exhaustion of always having to be someone, the quiet grief of living for the approval of an invisible audience, the anxiety of never quite arriving. Stillness brings us back to the threshold of our realness, and realness, unlike performance, is unpredictable. It may ask you to stop, to grieve, to rest, to let go of something that no longer fits, even if everyone else thinks it suits you. This is why so many avoid the stillness, not because it is empty, but because it is honest. It cannot be faked. It doesn't care who you're trying to be. It only reflects what is. But what is enough, always has been. And when you let yourself feel that, without decoration, without justification, you don't become less. You become whole, not fixed, not polished, just whole, in all your mess and softness and unfinished truth. So let the stillness hold you. Let it undo the noise you mistook for selfhood. Let it remind you what you are beneath becoming. Let it be the beginning of something quieter and truer. Not as an escape, but as a homecoming. There is a place inside you where unfinished things go to sleep. A flicker of a thought never written down. A sentence that once sparked but faded midway. A half-shaped idea whispered into the back of a notebook then crossed out before it had a chance to breathe. A beginning without an end, a truth you almost said. This is the graveyard of first drafts. It is not filled with failure, it is filled with fragments. Moments when you were almost ready to be honest, when you felt something worth expressing but hesitated. You second-guessed, rewrote, backspaced, not because the thought was wrong, but because it was raw, too strange, too soft, too uncertain. So you buried it, not with rejection, with silence, and you moved on, as if it never lived at all. But the graveyard remembers. It remembers the poem you started after waking from that dream. It remembers the letter you never sent, the confession you nearly shared before deciding it was too much, the voice memo deleted before you listened back. These aren't ghosts of what could have been. They're seeds, dormant, waiting, because every first draft contains a pulse, a trace of something unfiltered, unapproved. It is the part of you that acts before explanation. And when you bury it too often, something vital in you starts to dim. Not because the draft was genius, but because it was yours. Unperformed, unrefined, untranslated. We are taught to edit before we speak, to smooth the edges before offering, to only share what's clear, strong, coherent. But real creation is rarely clean. It is wild at first, disobedient, illogical. It contradicts itself. It doubts its own voice. It stumbles into beauty accidentally. And that's what makes it real. The graveyard of first drafts isn't a failure of effort. It's a symptom of a world obsessed with outcome. We stop mid-thought because we imagine the judgment. We delete sentences because they aren't impressive. We abandon ideas because they don't yet have form. But all beginnings look foolish at first. The sketch, the phrase, the tremor of a concept, they are supposed to be unfinished. The truth is, we rarely let things be born ugly. We confuse messiness with unworthiness. We confuse uncertainty with weakness. We forget that clarity emerges, it is not handed down. And by demanding perfection too early, we silence what might have mattered most. Because the first draft doesn't exist to be right. It exists to be honest. It carries the rhythm of your real thoughts. Before polish takes over, it reveals what you actually feel. Before performance intervenes, it is the closest you get to the unspoken part of yourself. And when you give it space, not to impress but to exist, it teaches you who you are beneath what you show. But we've become so practiced at ignoring this. We write with the audience in mind before we finish the first line. We measure value by reception instead of resonance. And so we leave our rough edges unexpressed. We leave our tender beginnings buried. Still they wait. The drafts you discarded are not dead. They whisper in half-formed thoughts. They return in the words you almost say in conversations that feel safe. They hum in your journal margins, in daydreams, in long walks with no destination. They are not demanding to be published. They are asking to be heard. Not everything unfinished is incomplete. Some things are meant to stay raw, to remain as evidence of your willingness to begin, to mark where your voice started before it learned to wear armor. And perhaps the graveyard isn't a graveyard at all. Perhaps it's a compost pile. Not a place of endings, but of transformation. Your forgotten thoughts feed your future ones. Your abandoned drafts fertilize the soil of your next idea. What didn't work becomes what deepens the work that follows. What you once thought was failure was just root. So visit it. The folder of unsaved documents, the crumpled pages, the memories of what you were too afraid to say. Sit among them, not to judge, not to rescue, just to witness, to say, you mattered, even in your brokenness, especially in your incompletion. Let your first drafts live. Let them be ugly. Let them contradict. Let them wander. Let them exist without needing to become something else. Because what you abandon, if you are gentle, may return. Not in the same form, but as a new beginning, a cleaner breath, a braver truth. The graveyard is not a grave. It is a mirror. It reflects who you were when you were still unafraid of trying. And maybe what you need now is not a masterpiece, but permission to begin again. But beginning again requires a softness we're rarely taught. It means meeting yourself without the armor, returning to the page or the moment or the feeling, without needing to impress, without needing to win. It means writing without a plan, speaking without rehearsing, thinking without rushing to conclusions. It means letting the mess be seen, even if no one else ever sees it but you. The graveyard of first drafts becomes sacred when you stop treating it like failure and start treating it like evidence. Evidence that you tried, that you felt, that you listened to something within, even if only briefly. Evidence of an inner life not yet shaped into clarity, but alive. And aliveness, not perfection, is what keeps the soul breathing. The world will tell you to hide it, to show only the finished version, to erase the traces of your trying. But trying is holy, and every first draft, every stammered sentence, every idea that never found its form is part of your becoming. So return, not to fix, return to honor, to walk gently among your discarded beginnings, to see what still pulses, to remember what once lit you up, even if it faded before the fire caught. Because sometimes the second beginning is stronger. Not because it's clearer, but because it's braver. You're no longer starting from scratch. You're starting from witnessed history. The graveyard is not a place to mourn what didn't make it. It's a place to gather your fragments, to remember that what was once unfinished is sometimes exactly where the truth begins. Once time was wide. It stretched out like a horizon we could never reach. Days were long, even when they were simple. Seasons arrived slowly and changed us. We watched trees grow, not apps update. We waited for things, for water to boil, for letters to arrive, for ourselves to become. Time was not something to beat or optimize. It was something to be in, something we belonged to, like weather or tides. This was deep time, the felt sense of life unfolding across more than one lifetime. It was the time of ancestors, of stories passed down, of aging as wisdom, not decline. It was the rhythm of clouds, not clocks, a form of time that asked nothing of you but presence, a time that made space for the invisible, for longing, for mystery, for change, too slow to track, but too true to ignore. Now we measure time in alerts, in refresh rates, in reaction windows. A day is too long. We need updates by the hour. A week is forever. We binge the future in one sitting. The slow pulse of existence has been replaced with the click, the ping, the scroll, the sense that if it's not now, it's nothing. We want what's next before what's now has even landed. We move so fast we never quite arrive, and in that speed we lose depth. We no longer sit with questions, we skim them, we don't wait for meaning, we search for content. We call it staying informed, being connected, keeping up. But what we're keeping up with has no floor. It moves faster than we can feel, faster than we can know. And deep time, the slow, sacred unfolding of our inner and outer worlds, disappears beneath it. You feel it in the way a month passes and you can't recall what changed. You feel it when your own memories feel pixelated. You feel it when the silence arrives and feels like an interruption, not a homecoming. And it costs us more than attention. It costs us meaning. Because deep time is where meaning grows. It's where love deepens past the thrill, where grief unfolds into understanding, where purpose stops being a slogan and becomes something you live. You cannot rush deep time. You cannot download it. You cannot hack it. It doesn't reward urgency. It asks for slowness, for presence, for repetition. It arrives not through novelty, but through staying long enough with something that it begins to change you. But we've been trained to abandon the slow, to grow impatient with nuance, to chase the peak and discard the process. So we abandon books halfway through. We leave conversations mid-thought. We cut friendships when they become inconvenient. We expect healing to be immediate and truth to arrive in headlines. And without knowing, we begin to live thin. Moments stack, but do not sink. We have memories, but not histories. We have data, but not wisdom. We touch everything, but are touched by nothing. Because deep time doesn't live in contact, it lives in commitment. To depth, to discomfort, to presence when the spark is gone, to holding a question for years before an answer reveals itself, to trusting that slowness is not stagnation, it is soil, and some truths grow only in soil. The disappearance of deep time is not about calendars, it's about consciousness. The shift from being within life to standing outside of it, managing it like a task. We've become spectators of our own experience, curators of our own timelines, performers in loops that once led inward, but now only lead forward. And yet, deep time is still here. Beneath the rush, beneath the pressure, it waits like bedrock. It is the rhythm of your heartbeat when you forget the clock. It is the way grief returns without asking. The way a memory visits when you smell a certain kind of rain. The way truth arrives quietly, after months of silence, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. To return to deep time is not to retreat from life. It is to re-enter it, to reclaim the pace at which your soul can breathe, to give up speed for depth, to choose presence over productivity. It starts with noticing, with letting a moment take longer than it should, with allowing a conversation to unfold without rushing to resolution, with watching the moon grow across a month and realizing you are not separate from its cycle, with making tea slowly, with writing something by hand, with rereading a book not to consume it, but to let it echo differently. You begin to move differently, not to go backward, but to go inward. You begin to hear your own rhythm again, beneath the tempo of the world. And in that rhythm, something ancient stirs, the memory of time that isn't disappearing, time that remembers you, time that shapes you slowly, the way water shapes stone, time that asks nothing but that you stay. long enough for the meaning to reveal itself, long enough for the root to take hold, long enough for you to become someone who does not just live in time, but is made of it. There is a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the softness in the voice that conceals a vacancy, a nod, a laugh, a gesture that seems right but feels hollow. This is the apathy no one talks about, the kind dressed in politeness, in pleasantness, in a face that says, "I'm fine," even when the soul beneath it is withering. Apathy doesn't always look like disengagement. Sometimes it looks like professionalism, like being endlessly agreeable, like showing up on time, saying the right thing, replying to every message, and never quite being there. You become fluent in the language of participation while slowly disconnecting from your own inner world. The lights are on. You smile when prompted. You function. But the current that once made you feel something, that pulse of genuine presence, has gone dim. We are taught early how to mask. We learn that big feelings make people uncomfortable, that too much curiosity can be annoying, that sincerity is awkward unless it's funny. So we dilute, we streamline, we sand down our edges until we fit, and somewhere along the way, the energy it takes to maintain the mask begins to cost us something quiet, something essential. You don't notice at first, you just feel tired. Not physically, not dramatically, more like a background hum of exhaustion. You start to dread small talk. You smile before your face catches up to the meaning. You laugh at things that don't move you. You check in with people out of habit, not care. You scroll through other people's joys and feel nothing but a vague sense of performance. Your own victories feel muted. Your sadness has no sharpness. Everything is slightly numb. This is apathy, not as laziness, but as defense. A response to overstimulation, a symptom of feeling too much too often, without space to metabolize it. So the system shuts down. Not completely, but enough to stay afloat. Apathy wears a smile because it's safer than explaining, safer than unraveling in front of people who might not understand. It's the protective layer you build when sincerity feels too risky. You say you're just tired. You say you're fine. You say it's nothing really. But somewhere inside, something is asking to be felt again. That something doesn't want you to fall apart. It just wants to be acknowledged. It wants to feel without having to explain itself. It wants to reconnect, not to the performance of life, but to life itself. And reconnecting doesn't mean breaking down in public. It doesn't mean discarding the smile completely. It means letting your own attention soften, letting yourself notice when the smile doesn't match the feeling, letting yourself pause when you want to say, "I'm fine," letting yourself admit, "I don't feel much right now, and that scares me," because apathy isn't emptiness. It's what rises when feeling feels unsafe. It's what shields you when meaning no longer lands. But meaning isn't gone. It's buried. Beneath the scripts, beneath the routines, beneath the version of you that gets through the day. To find it again, you don't need to force yourself to care. You don't need to fake depth. You need to listen, quietly, gently, to what still flickers underneath. Start small. Let yourself be moved by one honest sentence in a book. Let yourself cry without knowing why. Let yourself sit with a friend in silence and not try to fill it. Let yourself stop performing long enough to notice what's still alive in you, because apathy is not the end. It is the cocoon, a place your emotions go when the world becomes too sharp. And like all cocoons, it is not meant to be permanent. But to emerge, you must feel safe again, safe to be uncertain, safe to care about things that might not reward you, safe to speak without the need to be clever, safe to smile only when you mean it. We live in a world that confuses productivity with presence, that rewards the mask and mistrusts the pause. So it's no wonder we slip into apathy, even while laughing. It's no wonder we smile without feeling, speak without meaning, move without direction. But you are not broken. You are simply disconnected from the source that once made things matter. And that source is not lost. It is waiting. It lives in quiet places, in boredom, in slowness, in realness, in moments that don't perform well but feel true. Return to them, not all at once, not with pressure, just with permission. To not be fine, to not know, to not smile, and in that space, to let something stir, something old, something soft, something real. Because behind apathy is always a heart still trying to care. And behind the smile you've worn too long is a face waiting to feel everything you were once told was too much. There is a kind of laughter that doesn't come from joy. It comes from instinct, from discomfort, from the need to fill space that's grown too quiet, too honest, too strange. You laugh before you think, before you know what was funny. You smile when something hurts. You chuckle to soften the edge of a truth. Not because it's hilarious, but because the silence was beginning to tremble. Laughter, once spontaneous, becomes a reflex, an automatic script, a defense against depth. It lifts you out of a moment just as it begins to pull you in. At some point, we learned that stillness makes people uneasy, that being earnest too long without interruption invites risk. So we learned to interrupt ourselves. With jokes, with irony, with self-deprecation, we learned to coat vulnerability in humor, to end every open moment with a punchline, to turn tenderness into a setup, to make sure we are laughing before anyone else can. We were taught that it's better to be funny than exposed, better to be entertaining than real, better to keep things light than to let things land. But when laughter becomes the default response to anything real, something else begins to fade. You start to lose your connection to the ground beneath your words. You stop knowing what you actually feel, because everything is filtered through timing and tone. You rehearse reactions before you experience them. You build relationships around banter, not honesty. You laugh at things that make you ache. You laugh when you want to cry. You laugh when you're scared. And everyone thinks you're okay. Because laughter is socially acceptable, it's welcomed, it's rewarded. No one questions the person who's always smiling, always quick-witted, always fine. But behind the reflex is a person who hasn't been held in silence for a very long time. A person who's tired of being funny, tired of performing delight when what they long for is depth, tired of dodging the intimacy that comes right after the real moment, but never arrives because the laughter cuts it short. This is the paradox. Laughter is not the problem. Laughter is holy. It breaks tension, it heals, it connects, it reminds us we are alive. But when it becomes the default, the exit strategy, the mask, it slowly wears away our capacity for being seen. You begin to hide behind it even from yourself, because staying in the moment requires trust. It requires letting people see you without the echo of irony. It requires saying something sincere and not rushing to dilute it. It requires letting your words tremble instead of rehearsing them into smoothness. It requires risking silence, risking boredom, risking being misunderstood. Laughter is safe. It's controlled. It fills the room. It proves that you're okay, that everything is fine, that nothing has weight. But what if something does have weight? What if your silence was the bravest part? What if the story didn't need to be funny to be worthy of being told? What if the sadness wasn't something to dress up, but something to invite in? It's okay to laugh, but it's also okay not to. Okay to sit in a moment and not rescue it. Okay to let a conversation stay uncomfortable. Okay to say, "That actually hurts," and let that be the end of the sentence. Okay to be earnest. Okay to be slow. Okay to be uncertain. Not everything has to entertain. Not every truth has to end with a wink. When laughter becomes a reflex, the body forgets how to pause. The heart forgets how to be serious. The self forgets how to land. You begin to float through your own life, laughing at everything and feeling very little. But deep down, you still want to be held. Not as a joke, not as a performance, as a person, held in your unedited state, held in the moment before you made it palatable, held in the breath you usually skip past. You want someone to say, "You don't have to be funny right now." You want to say it to yourself, because the part of you that keeps laughing is also the part of you that longs to be quiet, to sit without flinching, to speak without decorating, to feel without entertaining, to know that you are lovable even when you are not making anyone else feel better. That's what real laughter returns to eventually. Not the reflex, but the release. Not the script, but the surprise. The laughter that comes after presence, not in place of it. The laughter that rises when you've stayed honest long enough to see the absurdity of being human. The laughter that doesn't cut the moment, but deepens it. That kind of laughter heals. But to reach it, you have to let go of the reflex. You have to risk being unfunny, uncool, unpolished, real. And in that risk, something opens. The smile softens, the mask loosens, the voice returns, and you find yourself not performing joy, but inhabiting it from the inside, from the place where laughter has roots, where presence lives without needing to escape, where the moment doesn't need to be saved, because finally you've allowed it to be. There is a moment, quiet, subtle, when an idea first arrives. It slips in through the side door of your awareness, gentle and unannounced, a flicker, a sentence fragment, a strange image that doesn't belong to logic yet. It's not ready to explain itself. It doesn't want to be analyzed or shared. It only wants to be followed. You don't even know where it's going. That's the point. Creativity begins not with clarity, but with curiosity, with surrender, with a strange, flickering pull towards something not yet formed. But in the modern world, very few ideas survive this moment, because before the idea can breathe, the committee arrives. Not a literal group, not even people always, but an internal panel, trained by years of feedback, audience expectations, algorithmic pressure, brand awareness, marketability. They show up with questions. Will people like this? Does this align with my voice? Can I monetize it? Is it on brand? Is it too weird, too soft, too honest? Will it perform? And just like that, the idea withers. It hasn't even taken shape, and already it's on trial. Not for truth, not for meaning, for viability. You assess its worth before you let it show you who it is. You ask it to justify itself before it's even had a chance to stumble into form. This is what creativity becomes when it's governed by committee. Not exploration, but evaluation. Not wonder, but strategy. Not a process of becoming, but a performance of being correct. And we wonder why we feel blocked. We wonder why the work feels flat or lifeless or overpolished, why the joy disappears somewhere in the middle, why we edit before we've written, why we second-guess even our most innocent ideas. It's not because we lack imagination. It's because we've built the habit of pre-approval. We've internalized the gaze. We've invited the audience into the writing room. We've let our future readers, real or imagined, sit beside us before the first draft is born. Creativity cannot thrive in that space, because creativity is inherently vulnerable. It begins before certainty. It begins in risk. It asks you to follow something fragile, something unproven, something that might go nowhere. And for a brief, sacred moment, you have to believe in something no one else can see. The committee can't help you here. They only know what already exists, what's already worked, what's already tested well. But creativity lives in the unknown, in the edge, in the strange. It doesn't care about what sells. It doesn't care about growth metrics. It doesn't care if it makes sense. It cares if it moves you. And if you give it room, quietly, without comment, it might grow. Not into something popular, not into something profitable, but into something true. And maybe that truth will find its place. Or maybe it won't. But it will have lived. And that too matters. Because not every idea needs to become a product. Not every draft needs to be content. Not every sketch needs to be shared. Some things are sacred because they remain yours. When creativity becomes a committee project, everything gets diluted. You round off the edges, you neutralize the weirdness, you filter the message, you swap what's true for what's trendy. You create something everyone might like, but no one will love. Because love comes from risk, from specificity, from the refusal to water it down. The most honest work always risks misunderstanding. That's why it matters. So how do we begin again? We begin by closing the door. Not forever, not to collaboration, but to preemptive compromise, to making things with one eye on the reaction, to shaping the soul of your work around the whims of the crowd. We make space for the thing that doesn't make sense yet. We trust the flicker before the form. We write it messy. We draw it wrong. We say it strangely. We don't ask it to be good. We ask it to be real. And when the committee arrives, as it always will, we thank them for their concern and ask them to wait, because there will be time for editing, for crafting, for refinement. But that comes after, not before. Creativity by committee creates what the world expects. Creativity by instinct creates what the world needs, even if it doesn't know it yet. So dare to make something no one asked for. Dare to say something that makes you nervous. Dare to follow a thread with no promise of reward. Not to prove anything, not to launch, not to go viral, but to return to the place where your imagination still breathes freely, where your ideas don't have to audition, where your inner world can speak before the world tells it how to perform. Because some of the most necessary work will never pass the committee. It will only pass through you. Strange, tender, incomplete, true. Let that be enough. Let that be the beginning. Nostalgia arrives gently. A song in the background, the scent of summer on asphalt, the rustle of a jacket you haven't worn in years. It doesn't knock, it seeps, it whispers. And when it speaks, it doesn't ask a question. It tells a story. Things used to be better. You believe it almost instantly. It doesn't need to explain why. It doesn't need to be accurate. Nostalgia isn't a historian. It's a storyteller. And its stories are always soft-lit, golden-toned, smoothed at the edges. It edits out the sharpness, the boredom, the pain. It offers not truth but comfort, not clarity but longing. That's why it's so powerful. Because nostalgia is not memory. It's memory wearing a mask. You think you miss a person, a place, a version of yourself. But often what you miss is a feeling, a way the world made sense back then, a simplicity you no longer have access to, a you that wasn't yet shaped by this many algorithms, this much urgency, this constant performance. Nostalgia tells you that things were better, but what it often means is, you were more open, you were more present, you were still looking forward instead of always catching up. You were still becoming. It's not that the past was free of pain. You simply remember the version of it that your body survived. The part you carry now has been cleansed of its confusion. And that's the trick. Nostalgia disguises itself as truth, but it's more like longing, wearing the clothes of memory. It gives us somewhere to rest, but also somewhere to hide. When the present feels directionless, we look backward, not because the past was perfect, but because it's finished. You know how those stories end. You know who you were. Even your heartbreak has shape now. It's easier to ache for something you survived than to open yourself to the uncertainty of now. So we stay in touch with old friends we've outgrown. We revisit films and shows that once moved us, hoping to feel again. We scroll through photos from the better years. We mistake familiarity for meaning, but nostalgia, if left unquestioned, becomes a trap, a loop of softened half-truths, a resistance to growth disguised as reverence. It tells us the present can't compare, so why bother trying? It makes new experiences feel pale, washed out. Because how can the present compete with a past that's been airbrushed by time? You begin to doubt your now. You begin to think your best moments are already behind you. You start living not forward, but in rewind. And slowly the appetite for presence fades. Not completely, but enough that you stop investing in new stories. You start curating your life not for depth, but for documentation. To create future nostalgia. To capture moments so that you can miss them later, even if you never really lived them now. Nostalgia becomes a lens. It colors how you see everything. You stop asking what this moment could become. You ask only how it compares to the past. And that's how nostalgia hides its cost. It feels beautiful. But sometimes it's a substitute for grief. Grief for the self you no longer are. Grief for the simplicity that's gone. Grief for the time before you knew what you know now. And that grief deserves space. But nostalgia as a disguise rarely allows it. It distracts with longing instead of letting you mourn. It says, go back instead of feel this. It says, recreate instead of release. So how do you unmask it? You begin by remembering that the past was not perfect, that the person you were back then was just as uncertain, just as searching. You begin by letting yourself feel what the nostalgia covers, not just the sweetness, but the ache beneath it. You let yourself grieve, not just what happened, but what didn't. The friendships that faded quietly, the words you never said, the possibilities you abandoned, the innocence that was shaped into strategy. You stop trying to go back. You start trying to go deeper, not into memory, but into presence. Because your life is not behind you. It is here, even if it's unclear, even if it's ordinary, even if it doesn't sparkle the way you remember things once did. Sparkle can be an illusion. What matters is texture. And the present has texture, if you slow down enough to feel it. The problem is not that we remember, it's that we forget what we're in. We forget that the same way we now long for yesterday, we will someday long for today. The way the light comes in through the window, the quiet in the kitchen after everyone's gone to sleep, the way your thoughts feel on a rainy afternoon. You don't have to rush. You don't have to perform. You don't even have to be happy. You only have to enter your life as it is, not the one you used to have, not the one you're trying to build, the one that's breathing under your fingertips right now. Because nostalgia, when unmasked, can become something gentler, not a trap, but a teacher. It reminds you that your heart is capable of depth, that you are wired to feel, that you are sensitive to time, not because you are weak, but because you care. And caring is still possible now, even in the ordinary, even in the uncertainty, even in the unrecorded moments. So remember the past. Let it warm you. Let it remind you who you've been. But don't let it define who you are. Because the most beautiful moment of your life might not be the one you've already lived, but the one you're living right now, unfiltered and finally seen. It didn't happen with a declaration. There was no siren, no glitch, no universal shift in tone. Just a slow, quiet folding of the self. One day you spoke and your voice had a caption. One day you moved through a moment and it already had a frame. One day you looked at your life, not to live it, but to present it. The change was subtle, invisible, but irreversible, because you didn't just share yourself, you became the thing being shared. That was the day we became content, not content as in satisfied, content as in product, as in consumable. A stream of polished pieces, sliced and captioned, optimized for visibility. The inner world transformed into a timeline. The question was no longer, what am I feeling, but how will this look? Not who am I becoming, but will this perform? And the shift, though gradual, reached everything. We started to move with the camera in mind, even when no one was watching. We wrote our thoughts with an audience we couldn't see. We experienced joy, already grieving how quickly it would expire in the feed. Even solitude became strategic, a chance to share how well we were resting. The texture of life, its nuance, its silence, its stumbles, was replaced by curation. We were still there, technically, but flattened, compressed, reduced to highlights and headlines. Somewhere in this process, the self became a project, not a being to inhabit, but a brand to manage, not a soul to listen to, but a message to broadcast. Every action became a statement, every silence a marketing strategy, every emotion a potential engagement metric. And with each layer of polish, something sacred slipped. We lost the unfiltered, the raw draft, the parts of us that make no sense, that contradict, that live only in real time and dissolve before they can be explained. These are the parts that never make it to the feed. The conversation you regret and learn from, the messy attempt at love that didn't look cute, the deep question you don't know how to word yet. These are the parts that made us human. And now they are left on the cutting room floor, because content must cohere. It must be legible, it must offer value. But the human experience doesn't always offer value. It offers presence. It offers aliveness. It offers moments that bloom and rot without warning. And when we demand that every moment be captured, we stop letting them live. We interrupt intimacy to document it. We narrate our grief before it has time to settle. We rush to translate feelings into formats before they have even arrived. And in doing so, we become less like people and more like platforms. We learn to perform authenticity. We become fluent in vulnerability as content. We cry publicly, but never deeply. We share revelations we haven't finished metabolizing. It's not that we're dishonest. It's that we're always one step removed. We're always aware of the mirror, always writing the story before we've lived the ending. That's the day we became content. Not just our faces, our food, our thoughts, but ourselves. Our solitude became scenery. Our friendships became collaborations. Our identity became marketing. And we were praised for it. For being transparent, for being creative, for being so beautifully open. But openness isn't real when it's rehearsed. Creativity isn't free when it's forced to perform. Transparency is not vulnerability if it's always strategic. And so we smiled, we posted, we adapted. And somewhere inside, a part of us stopped showing up. Not to the world, to ourselves. We stopped having experiences that were just ours. We stopped trusting the voice that doesn't speak in hashtags. We stopped writing things we didn't plan to publish. And slowly we stopped growing. Because growth requires privacy. It requires room to be wrong, to contradict, to not know. But when your identity is always on display, who dares to evolve? Who dares to risk being misunderstood when the algorithm rewards the familiar? Who dares to hold a complicated truth when the feed wants resolution? So we stayed the same. Even when we changed, we posted through this transformation and let our real selves become ghostwriters for our personas. But the thing we rarely ask is, what was the cost? What did we lose when we became content? We lost the sacredness of the unshared moment. We lost the value of process over product. We lost the right to not know what something means yet. And most of all, we lost the permission to be incomplete. because content must conclude, it must summarize, it must offer a takeaway. But your life is not a takeaway. Your thoughts are not bullet points. Your heart is not a carousel post. Your truth cannot always be compressed into clarity. Sometimes it is incoherent. Sometimes it is still forming. Sometimes it is simply yours, and it is allowed to stay that way. So maybe today is the day we remember. We are not content. We are not products. We are not brands. We are not messages. We are not the sum of our visibility. We are not made to be consumed. We are made to be, to live, to feel things all the way through, to write what no one reads, to dance when no one watches, to cry without recording, to change in the dark slowly, awkwardly, without explanation, to become something that can't be posted and never needed to be. It starts innocently. A to-do list too long, a schedule too crowded, a life built on momentum that won't slow down. And so you delegate, just a little. You ask for help, you automate, you optimize, you offload what feels tedious, what feels repetitive, what drains you. This is good. This is practical. This is how things get done in a world that never stops asking. But somewhere in that practicality, you begin to lose something quieter, something harder to name. You start handing off more than tasks. You start outsourcing pieces of yourself. You stop cooking and start consuming. You stop writing and start summarizing. You stop thinking deeply and start scanning headlines. You stop making and start managing. And slowly you stop showing up, not just in your work, but in your life. Not because you don't care, but because you're efficient. Because delegation works. Because you've learned how to make systems carry the weight. Because why write your thoughts when someone else has already said it better? You become an administrator of your own experience. You oversee, you coordinate, you manage, you live in bullet points. You respond instead of initiate. You skim instead of dive. You let the tools decide the tempo. And while everything appears in order, something inside begins to recede. You're no longer exhausted, but you're no longer moved. You're no longer drowning, but you've stopped creating waves. You don't feel behind, but you don't feel in it either. You've delegated the friction out of your day. But friction is where growth lives. You've delegated the repetition. But repetition is where intimacy begins. You've delegated the slowness. But slowness is where meaning is made, because there are parts of the self that do not survive second-hand experience. They do not translate well. They do not compress. They cannot be simplified into tasks and passed off. They only emerge through doing. You cannot outsource wonder. You cannot automate the ache that precedes a breakthrough. You cannot delegate the moment when something beautiful happens by accident. And yet, this is what modern life invites us to forget. We are trained to delegate discomfort, to find the fastest way through, to never be bored, to never do something slowly and badly just because we want to. We hire others to feel our way through our lives. We subscribe to personalities. We consume curated thoughts. We read someone else's synthesis instead of staying long enough with the raw data of our own perception. We've become spectators of our own depth. And the irony is, delegation works. It makes things smoother, faster, scalable. But not everything you are is meant to be scalable. Some parts of your soul were meant to be clumsy, to move like smoke, to get lost in the process and not emerge with anything useful. And when those parts go unfed, they begin to fade. You stop dreaming your own dreams. You stop hearing your own language. You stop knowing what you truly believe. Because you've read so many takes, you can't find your original voice in the static. The death by delegation is not dramatic. It's quiet, it's polite, it's productive. You get more done, you feel less. And in the quiet, something irreplaceable disappears. So, what would it mean to reclaim it? Not to do everything yourself, not to reject help, but to notice what you've outsourced that should have remained intimate, to take back the tasks that connect you to the ground of your own being. Make something slowly. Write something that no one will edit. Walk without tracking your steps. Read without looking for a takeaway. Cook without a timer. Sit in a question without asking for someone else's answer. Bring your body back into the rhythm. Bring your heart back into the risk. Bring your soul back into the act of doing, not to finish it, but to feel it. Because some parts of you are only reachable through your own hands, through your own rhythm, through your own time. And no amount of efficiency will bring them back once they're gone. This is not a warning, it's an invitation to return to what cannot be improved, to make peace with slowness, to let your life be a practice, not a project, a process, not a pitch, to live less like a manager and more like a maker. Because you are not a machine, you are not a workflow, you are not a series of outcomes, you are a pattern of breath, a tangle of contradictions, a living question, and no one else can answer it for you. No one else can walk it for you. No one else can feel it for you. Some parts of being alive can't be delegated, and it's in those parts, quiet, slow, inconvenient, that you meet yourself again. But meeting yourself again won't feel triumphant. It won't feel like clarity. It won't feel efficient. It may not even feel good. At first, it will feel awkward, tedious, unimpressive. You'll sit down to write and hear nothing but echoes. You'll cook your own meal and wish you'd just ordered out. You'll try to speak in your own voice and realize how often it's been shaped by what you think others want to hear. That's the moment where most people stop, when the silence feels heavier than the noise ever did. But that silence is sacred. It means the process is beginning. Because reclaiming what you've delegated isn't about proving something. It's about remembering something, relearning the rhythm of your own attention, rebuilding the bridge between your inner world and the physical one. And that bridge is built in small ways, by touching the raw material of your life again without immediately smoothing it into a product. It's not glamorous, it's not always visible, but it's real. And realness in a world of outsourced everything is revolutionary. When you sweep your own floor, something shifts. When you write your own thank you, something softens. When you stay in a moment without narrating it, something returns. Presence does not scale, and it's in presence, not productivity, that you begin to feel again. And maybe feeling is the point, not the finished thing, not the perfect form, not the marketable version, just the tremble of your own aliveness, held gently in your own hands. Because not every part of you was meant to be passed along. Some things must be done by you, not for the outcome, but for the intimacy of remembering you are still here. There was a time when you noticed the leaves, not because you were told to, not because someone shared a photo of them, but because you were there, present enough to see the green go gold, then crimson, then paper-thin brown before the wind took them. You remember, somewhere in the back of your bones, what it felt like to stop mid-step just to watch one spin down. You didn't think of productivity then. You didn't reach for your phone. You didn't narrate the moment or turn it into metaphor. You simply watched. That was before the world became a blur, before your attention was sliced into smaller and smaller intervals, before every pause begged to be filled, before the beauty of the ordinary became background noise in a feed designed to outdo it. The leaves still changed, they still fell, they still gathered on the sidewalk like quiet confetti. But you, without realizing it, stopped seeing them, not seeing with your eyes, seeing with your attention, seeing with that inner hush that used to arrive when the world did something quietly beautiful. A tree swaying, a child laughing, the way the morning light bends through a curtain. You didn't stop loving these things. You just stopped entering them. Because there is a difference between looking and noticing. Looking happens all the time. Noticing happens when you arrive. And somewhere along the timeline of your life, arrival stopped being a habit. It became something rare, something you had to schedule. You started moving through spaces like a ghost in your own body. Your eyes scanned, but they didn't land. Your feet moved, but they didn't feel. And the leaves fell, season after season, without ever once asking for you to watch, but hoping you would, because the world does not demand attention. It offers it. It waits for you, patiently like a friend at a window. It changes whether you notice or not, and its beauty isn't diminished by your distraction. But something in you is. You didn't stop noticing the leaves all at once. It happened slowly, like erosion. You got busier, more tired, more connected, yet more removed. You filled your days with updates, responses, fragments. You filled your mind with noise. And the quiet stopped finding places to land. So your senses adjusted. They stopped reaching. They flattened. And life became sharper in outline but blurrier in meaning. You still knew the seasons were changing. You just stopped feeling it. And in that subtle shift, something ancient within you dimmed. Because noticing isn't just about beauty, it's about relationship, to time, to place, to presence. When you noticed the leaves, you were part of the cycle. You weren't watching nature, you were nature, a living thing in rhythm with other living things. But the modern world convinces you that you are separate. That time is a resource to manage. That moments must be mined for value. That stillness is a luxury, not a birthright. And so you look at trees but don't feel awe. You walk through parks but don't remember the smell. You post the sunrise and forget to watch it. And you wonder why everything feels thinner, why joy seems like a task, why your chest feels tight for no reason. Maybe it's because the part of you that once noticed leaves has gone quiet. But it's not gone. It waits. Beneath the algorithms, beneath the scheduling, beneath the scroll. It waits in the moment before you respond to a notification. It waits when you sit down without your phone and don't know what to do. It waits in the rustle of the branches you no longer hear. And the way back is not dramatic. You don't need to retreat into the mountains. You don't need a digital detox or a vow of silence. You only need to pause for 1 second longer than you're used to, long enough to feel the wind move, long enough to look up instead of down, long enough to let beauty arrive, because noticing is not a task, it's a return to your senses, to your breath, to the part of you that still believes in wonder. Start small. Notice the leaves on the sidewalk, not to photograph them, but to be with them. Notice the way your hands feel on cold mornings. Notice the smell of rain before it comes. Notice the part of you that softens when you see something alive doing what it was made to do. You may feel foolish at first. You may feel like you're wasting time. But what you're actually doing is re-entering your life. You are rewiring your attention back toward what is real. And slowly the leaves begin to speak again, not in words, in presence. They say, "You are still here." They say, "You didn't miss everything." They say, "It's not too late," because noticing the world is how we remember we belong to it. And the moment you start noticing the leaves again is the moment you start coming back to yourself. There was a time when something lit you up from the inside. Maybe it wasn't dramatic, maybe it wasn't even visible to anyone else, but it was real. A spark that tugged you out of routine, a feeling that made time bend. You'd talk about it with more energy than you meant to. You'd lose sleep, not out of anxiety, but because your mind wouldn't stop dancing with the idea of more. Not more success, not more validation, just more of it. The thing, the practice, the pursuit that didn't need to make sense. It just needed to be followed. And then one day, quietly, it went quiet. Not gone, just quiet. As if someone turned the volume down, as if that part of you was still moving, but behind glass. You go through the motions now. Maybe you still do the thing. Maybe you still show up, produce, perform. But the edge is gone. The color has drained. And when people say, "You're so passionate about it," you smile, but don't quite feel the truth of it anymore. This is passion on mute, a slow dimming of the internal fire. Not because you stopped caring, but because something changed. Maybe it was the pressure to monetize, to grow, to turn your joy into a deliverable. What was once sacred became strategic. The open-ended became outcome-driven. You stopped exploring and started optimizing. You turned your soul into a system. Or maybe it was the noise. Everyone else doing it better, louder, with more followers, more gear, more coherence. You started comparing before you even began. You started editing before you finished feeling. You began to speak in hashtags, in templates, in borrowed conviction. Or maybe it was just life. Bills, deadlines, disappointments. Maybe you got tired of showing up and being misunderstood. Maybe it became too much work to keep loving something that didn't always love you back. So passion didn't leave. It stepped back. It curled inward. It got quiet enough that you began to wonder if you'd imagined it. But you didn't. It was real. And it still is. It's just waiting. Not to be rebranded, not to be justified, but to be listened to again. Because passion isn't always loud. It isn't always shiny. Sometimes it returns in silence, like a breath you didn't know you were holding. It whispers in the smallest pull. The urge to write one honest sentence. The desire to pick up the instrument even if no one's watching. The curiosity that draws your hand toward the unfamiliar, not for outcome, but for joy. To unmute passion, you must stop demanding clarity. You must stop asking it to justify its presence with performance. You must stop expecting it to make sense in a world that rewards polish over process. You must remember what it felt like before it had to prove anything. Do you remember? The thrill of getting lost in it, the freedom of not knowing where it would lead, the way your body felt when it moved with, not against your interest, the way time stretched and softened, the way it didn't matter if you were good at it, only that it was yours. That version of you still lives inside, muted maybe, but not dead, and it doesn't need a grand gesture to return. It needs space, a few minutes without expectation, a choice made without strategy, a moment of curiosity protected from judgment. Let yourself move toward the thing again, not to master it, not to explain it, but to be with it. Start badly, start clumsily, start with the part of you that still remembers why it mattered. You may feel nothing at first. That's okay. Passion doesn't respond well to pressure. It blooms slowly in presence, not performance. And as you sit with it, quietly, gently, inconsistently, something starts to shift. Not dramatically, just enough. A flicker, a new breath, a moment where you realize you're feeling again. Not excitement, necessarily. Something subtler, like alignment, like recognition, like coming home. Because passion isn't always a fire. Sometimes it's an ember. Sometimes it's the soft heat beneath everything else. And you don't need it to burn bright. You only need it to be alive. You're allowed to begin again. You're allowed to love something without turning it into content. You're allowed to be lit up without explaining why. You're allowed to want what doesn't scale. You're allowed to follow what makes no sense. Because passion was never about impressing. It was about connecting. To yourself, to something beyond you, to the part of life that doesn't answer to logic. So when you notice the flicker, don't ignore it. Don't analyze it. Don't ask it for a 5-year plan. Just breathe and let the volume rise, slowly, gently, one honest note at a time. Passion doesn't roar back, it hums. Quiet at first, like background music returning to a room that forgot it was ever silent. It's not about productivity, and it's not always accompanied by joy. Sometimes it feels more like grief. Grief for the time lost, for the versions of yourself you abandoned trying to become someone practical, for the spark you dimmed in the name of being efficient, professional, strategic, realistic. But that grief is part of the return. Because when passion comes back, it doesn't just revive your creativity, it revives your capacity to feel, to be moved by something for no other reason than that it moves you. And in a world that trains us to function, feeling deeply is resistance. Choosing to follow what you love, even quietly, even imperfectly, even when no one notices, is an act of reclamation. So let the ember glow. Let the thing be just for you. Let it be slow. Let it be uncertain. Let it be a terrible painting or an unfinished story or a song that only exists between your ribs. Let it live without being optimized. Let it live because you do. Because maybe passion was never meant to shout. Maybe it was only ever meant to whisper, "You're still here. You still care. This still matters." And maybe that's enough. maybe that's where everything begins again. You wake up and immediately begin to narrate, not out loud, but in your mind, where the camera is always rolling. You imagine what this moment could be, how it might look, what it says about you. You rehearse your reply before the message arrives. You frame your thoughts before they finish forming. You walk into your day not to experience it, but to manage it, to direct it, as if your life were a scene and you are both the actor and the editor, trying to get it all right in one take. This is how it begins. Rehearsing life before living it. You plan conversations you never have. You practice smiles in the mirror. You pre-write captions in your head while you're still feeling the thing. You analyze your tone, your posture, your silence, your pauses. Not because you're dishonest, but because you're afraid. Afraid that if you don't get it right, you'll be misunderstood. Or worse, forgettable. Somewhere along the way, presence became too risky, so you started to prepare. You rehearse emotions before you feel them. You rehearse intimacy before it can hurt you. You rehearse your reactions so they don't reveal too much. You rehearse vulnerability by phrasing it just right. You do this with such fluency you forget you're doing it. Because performance is rewarded. Preparation is praised. Polish is preferable to rawness. We're told to be put together, to present well, to be clear and consistent. But clarity too early becomes costume. Consistency becomes a cage. And what you call preparedness may really be protection. Because the self that lives off script is harder to control. It's harder to defend. It says strange things. It cries too soon. It asks the wrong questions. It forgets what the point was and laughs instead. That version of you is messy, but alive. And when you rehearse too long, you start to lose it. Not all at once. Not dramatically. You still smile, you still function, you still show up. But it's as if the person who feels things deeply has been pushed behind the curtain, while the one who performs well stands in their place. And the longer you perform, the harder it is to remember what's real, because life cannot be rehearsed and lived at the same time. One requires control. The other requires surrender. You begin to forget how it felt to speak before editing, to try something without calculating the optics, to ask a question without having a quote ready for the answer, to walk into a room and simply be, instead of checking how you're being perceived. You feel it, don't you? The tension in your chest, the weight of pretending to be natural. The fatigue of always performing ease, the pause before every truth. You start to ask yourself, am I actually here? Or am I rehearsing this moment as a story to tell later? And slowly, that question starts to unravel things. You begin to notice how rarely you speak without structuring, how often you choose words not for honesty, but for effect. How many of your memories feel more like reenactments than realities? You remember a sunset, but more clearly, you remember how you framed it for a photo. You remember laughing, but more vividly, you recall how it sounded. You remember connection, but also how well it could have been captioned. You've been living around life, watching yourself move through it, curating it in real time, rendering it more legible than it actually was, safer, smoother, more approved. But where is the version of you that forgets to narrate? The one that doesn't calculate the impression? the one who says the wrong thing and laughs until they cry, the one who forgets the camera, the mirror, the script. That version of you may be buried, but it's not gone. It waits in the quiet space before you explain yourself, in the breath after the question, before you shape the answer, in the way your hand moves when no one is watching, in the thought you never write down, in the feeling that floods before you try to name it. To stop rehearsing doesn't mean to collapse. It doesn't mean being reckless or unfiltered all the time. It means returning to presence, even when it's uncomfortable. It means letting a moment happen before you decide what it means. It means laughing for no reason and not worrying how it looks. It means speaking and realizing you don't know where the sentence will land. It means trusting that who you are without polish is still worthy of being witnessed. But it's scary, because performance gives you distance, and distance protects you from pain, but it also protects you from intimacy, from connection, from wonder. When you stop rehearsing, you let yourself be surprised. You give up the illusion of control. And in its place, you get something real, something that can't be planned or packaged, something that lives and breathes and trembles in your hands, something like yourself. So start with one moment. Let it be awkward. Let it be unfinished. Let it be small. Say the thing before it's ready. Feel the emotion before you phrase it. Let the silence stretch instead of filling it. Trust that your unprepared self has something to offer. Not because it's perfect, because it's present. And presence unpracticed is how you finally begin to live. There was a time when silence was enough. You didn't need to fill it. You didn't fear it. You let it wrap around you like a warm night. Silence wasn't absence. It was presence, undivided. It was a soft room where you could sit with yourself, unguarded, a space between thoughts where something deeper could emerge. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was sacred. But somewhere along the way, silence changed. It stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like pressure. It stopped inviting stillness and started demanding distraction. You reached for your phone without meaning to. You scrolled without remembering why. You filled the quiet with podcasts, noise, words, anything. Silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like exposure. Because in the silence, everything you'd postponed came forward. The thoughts you drowned in music, the feelings you blurred in conversations, the ache you softened with stimulation, all of it waited patiently for the noise to stop. And when it did, you called it discomfort. So you kept filling it, not out of carelessness, but out of habit. Not because you didn't crave peace, but because you mistook peace for productivity. And when the room grew quiet, so did your confidence. You feared what might rise in that stillness. You feared what it might say. You feared that if you were still long enough, something unmanageable would surface. Grief you hadn't named, loneliness you hadn't accepted, longing you couldn't justify. So you drowned it in sound. You layered your days with content. You stopped walking without headphones. You turned solitude into consumption. You trained your attention to fear its own depth. And that fear, over time, becomes numbness, a slow erosion of intimacy. Not with others, but with yourself. You begin to forget how it felt to listen inward. You stop noticing the texture of your own thoughts. You start fearing your own company. This is what happens when silence is no longer sacred. You mistake noise for life. You mistake reaction for presence. You confuse stimulation with connection. But silence was never meant to be the enemy. It was meant to be the mirror. Not the harsh kind, but the soft kind that reflects who you are when no one's watching. The kind that doesn't demand an answer. The kind that allows something to emerge. Because silence is not empty. It is full of everything we've forgotten how to feel. It's where creativity takes root, where grief finds shape, where clarity whispers, where intuition stirs. It is the space where your soul returns to itself. But in a culture built on reaction, silence feels like rebellion. To be quiet is to disappear. To be still is to fall behind. To not answer, not post, not produce, feels like fading. So we stay loud, we stay fast, we stay filled. And yet, in the quiet moments that sneak through, right before sleep, just after a long drive, in the pause after a question, you feel it, the ache, the memory of what silence used to give you. The strange, half-forgotten sense that stillness once felt like home. And that's how you know it's not gone, only buried. Beneath the noise, the feed, the endless thread of someone else's voice. Silence is waiting, not to judge you, not to fix you, just to receive you, to let you rest, to let you remember that you are not just what you say, not just what you do, not just what you respond to. You are what remains when the performance ends. And that version of you, quiet, soft, uncurated, is sacred. So how do you return? Not with a schedule, not with rules, but with the smallest refusal, a breath taken without distraction, a walk without headphones, a pause before the next click, a morning without the hum of commentary. And when the silence feels unbearable, stay just one beat longer, until the discomfort becomes stillness, until the stillness becomes presence, until presence becomes peace, not the peace sold in packages, the kind that comes from being fully with yourself. Because silence, when honored, doesn't leave you alone. It leads you inward. It gives your mind space to unfurl. It gives your heart a place to speak. It reminds you that your value is not in how much you contribute, but in how deeply you belong to this moment. When silence is sacred again, you no longer rush to fill it. You make room for it. You let it hold you when words can't. You let it teach you what noise never could. And in that stillness, you remember the truth beneath the language, the presence beneath the pressure, the self beneath the performance. And that memory, quiet, honest, alive, is how you find your way back to yourself. But returning to silence is not always graceful. At first, it might feel like absence, like nothing's happening, like something's missing. You're so used to input, so trained to chase the next sound, the next spark, the next voice, that the absence of stimulation feels like a void. But silence is not nothing. It is invitation. It is space unoccupied by performance. It is time not yet claimed by urgency. And the more you stay, the more you begin to hear what the noise was covering. The part of you that's tired, not from work but from pretending. The grief that never found a shape. The longing that has nowhere to go in a life lived at full volume. In silence they arrive not to overwhelm, but to be witnessed. This is the slow return, not to a past self, but to the self beneath the static, not to a fixed state of peace, but to a place inside you that can hold what's real. And what's real is often tender, often strange, but it is yours, unpackaged, undistracted, alive. Let silence be a language again. Let it be a place, not a problem. Let it be a teacher that doesn't speak but reveals. Because the more you honor it, the more sacred it becomes, until the world softens around its edges and you find in the quiet that you are never alone. You were just waiting to hear yourself again. Some endings don't wait for the final moment. They begin in the distance between two people still sitting beside each other. They begin when the conversation grows quiet, not because everything's been said, but because neither of you knows how to speak what's true. They begin when someone stops showing up with their whole self and the other pretends not to notice. This is how we start dying before we say goodbye, not with absence, with avoidance, not with anger, with airlessness, the kind that builds in spaces where honesty is afraid to enter. We smile, we stay, we continue the rituals. But underneath, something is pulling back. A slow exhale of connection, a fading of presence. You don't always know it's happening. At first it feels like fatigue, a pause in the middle of a text you don't finish, a hesitation before sharing what once felt effortless. You tell yourself you're just busy, tired, distracted, but deep down, something else is shifting. Sometimes it's love softening into nostalgia before we're ready. Sometimes it's a friendship that outgrew its common ground. Sometimes it's trust unspoken for too long, calcified into silence. Sometimes it's simply a story you were writing together that no longer wants to continue. But instead of ending it, we delay the death. We keep the body of the relationship moving even after the soul has left the room. We stay because saying goodbye feels too final, too violent, too clear. We want the comfort of presence without the cost of confrontation. So we pretend. We pretend we didn't notice the shift. We pretend the closeness hasn't frayed. We pretend we still mean the words we stopped feeling. And, slowly, we disappear from each other, while still being in the same room. This is the quiet grief no one names, the kind that comes when love ends without declaration, when connection fades without rupture, when goodbye never gets spoken because we're too afraid it might echo. So we wait for the moment to be obvious. We wait for it to end on its own. We wait for someone else to name the emptiness. But sometimes waiting becomes the wound, because in the absence of goodbye, something in us doesn't finish the process. We don't mourn, we don't thank, we don't let go. We just carry the ghost of what almost was, and what used to be, and over time that ghost weighs more than a goodbye ever could. Saying goodbye is not cruelty, it's completion. It is not abandonment. It's the honoring of a thing that mattered enough to end with truth. It is the moment we stop pretending. It is the moment we say, "This meant something, and now it doesn't live the same way anymore." When we say goodbye, we allow space for real memory. Not the distorted version made heavy by avoidance, but the tender version made sacred by closure. We give each other the gift of being known all the way through, even to the end, and that is love too. To leave clearly, to let the other move forward without fog, to offer honesty even when it trembles. So if you feel it dying, the friendship, the closeness, the chapter, don't keep it on life support for the sake of ease. End it with care. End it with gratitude. End it while there's still something soft between you. Because the only thing lonelier than goodbye is not getting the chance to say it, and the only thing heavier than loss is pretending the love didn't end, when it already had. But endings, when left unspoken, don't vanish. They ferment. They twist themselves into the background of your days, into the awkward pauses and the shallow laughs, into the unread messages you tell yourself you'll reply to soon. You think you're avoiding pain, but what you're really doing is prolonging it. Delaying grief doesn't make it gentler, it just makes it messier. And yet we do this all the time. We let connections hollow out while keeping up appearances. We rehearse honesty in our heads, but say nothing out loud. We keep meeting up even though the meaning has gone quiet. We keep calling it love when it's more like obligation. We keep showing up, hoping the feeling will return, when deep down we know it won't. Sometimes it's not anyone's fault. There's no betrayal, no explosion, no clear villain, just a slow drifting apart like two boats quietly pulled by different currents. But instead of waving across the water, instead of saying, "Thank you for sailing with me this far," we pretend we're still rowing the same direction. And in doing so, we deny both ourselves and the other person the dignity of a true goodbye. A goodbye that says, "This mattered." A goodbye that says, "I won't rewrite the past to make this easier to leave." A goodbye that says, "Even endings deserve our full presence." But we are afraid of endings. We confuse them with failure. We treat them like shame. So we let things rot instead of letting them rest. And then we wonder why we carry so much unresolved weight, why memories feel tangled, why we flinch when old names appear, why we grieve people we haven't spoken to in years. It's because part of us never left. Part of us is still standing in the unsaid, still waiting for a moment that never came, still carrying conversations that never closed. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Goodbye is not the absence of love. It is a form of love. It is the moment you care enough to finish the story, to mark its ending with clarity instead of confusion, to say, "This chapter is over. Let it rest." Not every goodbye requires ceremony. Sometimes it's a quiet message. Sometimes it's the choice to stop reaching out. Sometimes it's the decision to let the unanswered question remain unanswered. But what matters is the intention. The decision to stop pretending, to stop waiting, to stop dying slowly in a connection that already let go of you. And if you've been holding on to something long gone, a friendship that no longer fits, a version of love that stopped growing, a closeness that now feels like distance, this is your permission, not to cut it out cruelly, not to turn your heart off, but to release it with reverence, to say goodbye, not because it wasn't real, but because it was, and pretending otherwise is no longer kind to either of you.